Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is Ted Goldstein from This Way Up, and today we are very excited. We have Liza Libes here from Pens and Poison to talk about her new debut poetry book, Girl Soldier. It's available on Amazon. Uh, can't wait to get started.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Ted, and I'm really excited to chat with you today about poetry and all the rest of the good stuff.
Absolutely. So let's get right into it. When did you start writing poetry?
So, I want to say in middle school was when I first got into it. So I'll tell a really cool story. I had this seventh grade English teacher who I think really just changed my life. They say that there's always that one teacher who really makes a difference. I had this seventh grade English teacher. Every Friday, he would bring in a poem from, famous poets we read. Um, Kind of Langston Hughes. We read a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. We read just, kind of poems across the board, poems that maybe weren't too difficult for kind of a seventh grader to understand. And one of the poems that I just distinctly remember him bringing was The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. And what he did, it's kind of a poem. It's about a lot of things, but um, the teacher wanted us to kind of interpret it very literally, so the poem's called The Snowman. So we read it in January. And I grew up in Chicago. It's very cold. He took us all outside, and for the entire class period, he had us stand around the kind of courtyard or playground or whatever it was and just look at the snow, just like the listener in the Snowman poem. And I remember just feeling distinctly annoyed at this exercise because it's like, I just want to sit here reading poetry. Why are we standing outside? And then he made us come back and then read the poem again after standing outside in the snow for an hour. And for some reason, I just had this like epiphany that all of a sudden I understood what this poem was about, of kind of listening to, the sounds in the snow. And I think that was probably the first time that I consciously remember just loving poetry and being just like generally emotionally affected by it. So I started to just kind of write down some sketches. Um, I got sent to the principal's office in the eighth grade because I wrote a poem about death and then showed it to my English teacher. And she was not very happy about this.
Right.
Um,
That's kind of a rite of passage for every young, sad poetry type, right?
That's right. And then after that, I just had a lot of poems that I was writing. I had this phase in high school where I exclusively wrote sonnets, because I had this big Keats phase. I love Keats, and I just read every single sonnet basically by Keats, and then wrote a bunch of sonnets, I think in the tradition of Keats. Got a couple of those kind of published in like various high school journals. And then in college, I got really into the poetry of T.S. Eliot, who is still my favorite poet to date. I had read Prufrock and The Wasteland back in high school, but didn't really, I think, understand them on the level that, I would have liked to understand them. So I got back to them in college, reread them, and I think T.S. Eliot just very quickly became my favorite poet. So I think I started to move a little bit away from maybe the, structured form of Keats and the romantic poems and more toward this kind of modernist poetry form. And then I wrote my senior thesis in college on the poetry of Sylvia Plath. So I think a lot of my poems resemble kind of this mix of Eliot and Plath, especially kind of maybe exploring some similar themes. The collection is called Girl Soldier. So obviously I have a lot of poems about kind of what it means to be a woman, but not maybe necessarily in the kind of traditional like feminist sense. I think I have kind of maybe a nuanced understanding of kind of femininity in the 21st century. And I think a lot of my poems explore what that means and, what it's like to kind of be a girl soldier, be a woman surviving the pitfalls of the 21st century.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I kind of got that feeling immediately from the first word and following through the whole way in the book that the ideas of gender and how one represents their femininity, right? Because it's not, I think we've seen a lot of depictions of the idea of a girl soldier being someone who is fundamentally masculine in a lot of ways. But it seems that the depiction that you're kind of putting forward is uh, it's a very nuanced and different vision, which is basically a form of soldiering through femininity. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great way to put it. So the poem's title collection, Girl Soldier, is the third poem in the collection. So the first poem is we'll get to that in a second. First poem is kind of about Jewish identity. The second poem is sort of about memory and childbirth, and was informed by some of my reflections about just kind of, getting older, thinking about having kids and existing in the modern world while having that desire. And then the third poem is actually, it came to me in a dream. I had this dream about this kind of battlefield where this kind of man was going off into war. And I think there's a little bit of the poem's fundamentally about just this girl who's a little bit upset by her lover going off into war, and maybe thinks he's going off into war for the wrong reasons. But I think beyond that, it's maybe an extended metaphor for this idea of kind of love as a battlefield, which is obviously a very kind of age old idea that I think poets have been exploring for many centuries at this point. So I think I try to contextualize that idea, put it into the modern world, and think about, okay, in contemporary society, what does it mean to be a woman? And then from there, after we have the introduction of Girl Soldier, a lot of the poems following in the collection explore kind of relationships, kind of woman versus man, woman versus society, and looking at this idea of, you know, how do women kind of go through relationships with, the people in their lives? How do women kind of look at society? And I think obviously a lot of these poems were inspired by some of my own experiences. Some of them are just kind of fictional ideas of little stories. I have a couple poems that are a little bit more like narrative in here that tell stories of, woman who, I have one poem called Sunday Evening Paper Boy that tells a story of a woman who is kind of chasing this man who belongs to like a different class. He's a paper boy, so it's set in kind of an older scene. So he's a paper boy, and she's kind of from this like upper class background, and kind of the pitfalls of their relationship. I think a lot of the poems are inspired by my own experiences. Some of them are just kind of little fictional stories that I like to tell based on ideas that I've had about, just observing the world around me.
Absolutely. I really love that phrasing of woman versus man in this kind of dynamic because I'm 26. How old are you?
I'm 28.
28. Okay, so we're basically of the same generation. We're in the kind of too young to be a millennial and too old to be Gen Z. So just kind of born like in the right time to remember the world when it was something that made sense.
That's right.
And I've been talking about this a lot with people about the for lack of a better word, the gender war that is basically happening. What I've found recently is that the people who seem to be the most upset about it are young women who basically feel that it's now impossible for them to date men. Like I was talking to these three girls who they were all like 24, 25, and they were basically, I asked them like how many times have you guys been asked out in public? Between the three of them, they'd been asked out once. Like one of them had been asked out one time by a man. And I know when I talk to young men, they're terrified of things of like going up and talking to a girl and things like that. So um, I'm curious, how has sort of modern romance and modern gender dynamics influenced you, especially as someone who's so deeply seated in the tradition? Someone who, if you've read everything by Keats, you're several steps ahead of me. So, you're really a serious poetry fan, and that comes across in the book.
Yeah, so I think I definitely want to echo what you just described. There's this kind of big gender split. Women hate men because, maybe they've had one bad experience, and then they extrapolate and say, "Oh, all men are evil," that sort of thing. And then that kind of makes men averse to talking to women because they feel like, okay, a woman's not going to like me anyway, or, she's going to report me for sexual harassment and whatnot. So there is a lot of that, I think, going on today. And I, still believe firmly in this idea of a traditional relationship. And I think when you read a lot of feminist poetry, you have this sort of like, oh my God, the man is at fault, men are terrible, that sort of thing. And what I really wanted to explore in my poems is kind of this both characters maybe are at fault, where, maybe one character feels kind of wounded, the other character feels also maybe as if they've wronged the other person. So it's kind of a two-way street rather than just, men suck or women suck or that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot more complexity to modern relationships than just, men suck and women, don't want to date men because they think that men suck. And I think that mentality is very harmful for most people. And I think you're seeing this kind of epidemic of loneliness in our society, especially, amongst young people. I have a lot of, male friends who are very single, kind of approaching their kind of my age, approaching their 30s, have maybe never been in a real relationship in their lives because they kind of villainize women. They think, "Oh, woman is XYZ thing." And then on the other side, women don't want to even talk to men. I mean, you have the also issue with dating apps, for instance, where, women are only swiping on like 10% of men and then the rest of the 90% just get no matches. Let's say there's kind of data on this, right? So I think there's a kind of an issue of misaligned expectations on both sides. And what I've really wanted to explore in my poems is kind of this idea of failed relationships, but more in the tradition of T.S. Eliot. Um, I I wrote my master's thesis actually on this idea that the wasteland is an exploration of kind of abortive relationships is the word I use in my thesis. This kind of failure of human interaction and kind of what the implications are of that. Eliot, puts forth this kind of wasteland society, but within that society, he explores this kind of miscommunication with men and women. And I think in many ways that's been exacerbated today. But I also have a couple poems that paint men kind of very beautifully. I have this poem called Indigo Arcadia, which is about this kind of Eden-like scene, this like very idyllic Arcadia scene where there are just kind of two lovers who are happy and are not hurt by the workings of society. So I think that society puts a lot of various pressures on us, but it's up to us to kind of still discover our shared humanity. And I think to me, that's what literature and poetry specifically has always been about is finding these little nuggets of shared humanity amidst this kind of era of polarization and divide.
Absolutely. I really love that phrase you used, the abortive relationships. For those of you who don't know, T.S. Eliot was a fantastic poet, anti-Semitic for, this is the Zionist voice, so we got to talk about it. But he was what we call a genteel anti-Semite. He was like a normal British anti-Semite as opposed to Ezra Pound, who was really a hardcore anti-Semite. T.S. Eliot wrote tremendous amount of excellent poetry. The Wasteland is probably his most famous work, which I believe came out in 1925 or 1926.
Yes, 20. I should know this. I should know this exact date.
We should all know this,
Um,
and we do know it. We're just pretending
I'm bad
not
at
to know it.
numbers.
Exactly.
22.
It came out in 22. Like I said, it came out in 1922, and he's one of the poets who's most closely associated with what we call the lost generation, which is the generation of writers who are writing following the devastation of World War One. And I think it's really interesting to talk about Eliot right now because something I've been thinking about is the lost generation. I had this poetic line that came to me, which was like, we are not the lost generation. We are the stuck generation. Because to be lost implies you were going someplace, you had some direction. But we were actually basically born with no direction, right?
Love
A
that.
lot of the traditional kind of sensations of what the world is supposed to be, like, just don't exist really in the 21st century. Even the idea of soldiering, right? Um, And so I'm curious, how does can you tell me more about how Elliot it seems like you had this moment with Elliot. So how did Elliot shape how you think about the world, and has that colored at all what you see happening in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll go back to The Wasteland and also talk about a couple of his other poems. I think a lot of what Eliot explores is this theme of alienation. So he has one of my favorite poems of his is Portrait of a Lady, which is actually one of his early poems, where he basically takes a look at this relationship between this older woman and this young man and how they have this general friendship that over time dissolves because they're maybe unable to find sort of common language. And I think that's what that kind of early Eliot poem sets the scene for a lot of Eliot's poems up until about the Four Quartets, which is because kind of later, like religious, like philosophical meditation. But I think what he explores in most of his very early poetry is this idea of this inability for two human beings to find a common language despite both being humans, and this kind of divide that exists. And that's a theme that he then comes back to in The Wasteland, where there are multiple scenes of men and women trying to talk to each other and not really understanding one another. There's actually, to bring up Prufrock, his other really, really famous poem, there's this part in Prufrock where this man keeps wanting to say something to this woman, and we don't know what he's trying to say to her. There are, various theories that scholars have put out, but he never gets to say that thing to the woman. And I think that's very, very central to kind of Eliot's whole ethos is this idea that kind of not only two human beings, but men and women are just fundamentally unable to speak to each other.
Right.
And
The
I
words
think,
unsaid.
yes, that's
Exactly.
right. And I think that surfaces in The Wasteland a lot. You have this famous scene with the Hyacinth girl, who kind of there's this I can't remember the exact line, but there's this line that's like, I could not speak, right? Where she feels stifled. She feels like she can't say what she's trying to say to her lover. There's this scene where a woman is discussing a potential abortion. There's a scene where this woman is kind of just like mechanically having sex with her lover, doesn't feel like very emotionally connected to him. So there are various relationships in Eliot where men and women just can't find kind of fundamental shared language. And I think it goes in Eliot, it goes beyond just kind of male female relationships. It also goes into like human relationships where he just feels like people are unable to talk to each other and really open up to each other. And I think that's very true in so many respects. And I do explore some of those poems and kind of some of these poems that I've written that are more fictional or just based on experience of these two people who maybe are unable to talk to each other. There's this one line I have in my poem called Stars, which was very directly inspired by Eliot. I'll go ahead and
And please
read it
show us the
here.
book too.
Oh,
As
yes, here's the book.
yeah.
It's a Girl
Remember, it's
Soldier.
called Gold Girl Soldier and Other Poems by Liza Libes, and it's available on Amazon.
That's right. Um, so okay, this line,
Not Lisa Libes, Lisa Libes.
you got it, Lisa Libes. So there's this a couple lines here. Tomorrow we will amble in each other's circles, trapped within the same old horrid universe where music rings out for two people, but only one can hear the melody. So I think that's I'm
Sorry,
very
can you please read it one more time for us?
sure. Sure. Tomorrow we will amble in each other's circles, trapped within the same old horrid universe where music rings out for two people, but only one can hear the melody. Very consciously channeling Eliot there. This idea that, you know, there's this common language of music that, is supposed to be the universal language, but one person kind of hears it, the other person interprets it maybe differently, and that's kind of creates this like rift or divide
Mhm.
between them. And I think that's kind of a big theme that I explore in so many of my poems here in Girl Soldier of just, this rift, this divide between two people who again are unable to find that kind of shared language and don't really know they're maybe talking to each other, but don't really know how to communicate. And I do think that that's, again, very, very prevalent. It was evidently prevalent in Eliot's society. I think it's very relevant to us today as well.
Can you please just read those last two lines for us again?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me find the page again. So, yeah, where music rings out for two people, but only one can hear the melody.
I I love that line so much. I mean, there's so many great lines in this book. One of the things that I think I'm really I guess fixated on right now is this idea of the divide between two people, and then what happens if we expand that actually to the whole social structure.
Sure.
And I was kind of in the I can't quite put my finger on it, but we've basically like for 4 or 5 thousand years we had like more or less the same gender relations, right? They were basically passed down father to son. The lesson that I was learned from my father is like you'll never understand women. You just won't. Like, do your best and just buy her flowers and be nice, because like you just won't get it. And in the 26 years I've lived, that's basically 100% correct. Every time I've got flowers, it's worked out. Every time I've tried to use my intellect, it hasn't. Um, and what I've heard, basically the traditional narrative about like for women dating men is like, yeah, men are completely stupid, but like you can fix them over time. Um, and I think one of the things that's happened recently is we've sort of blown up this dynamic. And this idea of the music playing for two people, but only one of them can hear it, I think is really, in some ways, a perfect description of this kind of gender war, which is like the music that we all are hearing is the music of love, right? The music of connection, the music of relationship, the music of human affection. It doesn't matter who it's between, but you can't have human affection if you don't come together. And I think we've in some ways kind of siloed ourselves into our identities, right? You're either a woman or your sexuality or your political framework, but you can't really interact with other people as whole individuals. And I want to go now to the second poem in the collection, Farmer's Market,
Sure.
which is one of my favorites. And I think it has, in some ways, some of I mean, it really kind of drips with this Eliot like um, longing, I think. Um,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I would actually just really like you to read it for us, the whole thing,
Sure.
if you may. This is
Let's do
Farmer's
it.
Market, poem 2 in Girl Soldier.
All right. Farmer's market. And how can I forestall the lapse of pleated skirts and princess dresses, lacquered shoes, because my feet will have grown fat? I never liked to haul a melon from the market. Instead, I'd gather raspberries and currants, fruits that did not garner pitiful mementos. The currants might have wept amongst the cherries and the blackberries, but thus they fostered peace. And now I'd rather not contain a melon. I do not need an older dame to rescind her claim upon the stage so that I can nurse my countenance at 30 as the subway rattles on. I do not wish to be abused by grimaces and knives, impaled like a swine, and like a rag doll sewn back up again. Might I be too selfish, fatalistic? Dare I reenact the Edens of my youth? Might I hope to see her in the garden fostering a pair of puppies? Might she be less clumsy, less afraid? And if I should be rendered sleepless, might I hope to hear this music in her dissonant crusade? Sometime in the evening, she'll adopt a chair before a fireplace, and with my walker I shall hobble over, reminiscing on those blackberries and currants, and she might press her hand to mine and whisper, Mom, you'll be with me forever. And might it be now time?
Thank you so much.
So tearing up a little bit.
Really,
I haven't
tell
wrote it,
me,
but yeah, I
tell me
think
why.
yeah, I mean, I think it's I this poem I think is very personal about me. And I think it captures I've had a lot of people tell me it captures, like, a lot of their experience. I was talking to someone earlier today, and she told me, "I think you adequately capture this kind of almost, like, taboo of women today talking about this desire to have children," and I think it's something that I think I've always been a career woman in many ways. I run my own company. I do a lot of writing. I have been, I think, very independent in my life, and I think that's the kind of the society that I grew up in. This kind of New York world that I found myself in as well has been kind of very career focused, and there's very little conversation of okay, at what point do you surrender yourself to this maternal instinct to just have kids? And I think the first part of the poem is this kind of protest against this idea of having kids, and the narrator's kind of going through these maybe there's reasons of, um, should she contain this melon, which is, the kind of metaphor for this child, and doesn't want to be kind of abused by grimaces and knives, like in the hospital where she's bearing the kid. And then she has this line that's kind of the turning point, which is, "Might I be too selfish, fatalistic?" And then she kind of realizes, well, we are, we're all, unfortunately, all of us are not going to be here one day. And yeah, we need to kind of figure out what to do about that. And I think for the answer, and this is the answer that I think Shakespeare gives, so many, this is the answer that Plato gives. The best way that we can preserve our lives is through bearing children, right? I think at that point, the narrator sort of pivots and she says, um, I can kind of relive so many of my memories through children. And then she decides, gotta have kids. Um, yeah, sorry, I'm like tearing up at this topic.
Don't
I don't know why.
apologize. I mean,
It affects me a lot.
poetry should poetry should cause tears of some variety, and if it doesn't cause tears, it's probably not a very good poem. Um, or maybe it has a different purpose. I write a lot of sad poetry, so I
Sure.
appreciate that. And I think in some ways I think we've also become very afraid of crying in modernity, and we have this sort of weird, like, talking about children, this sort of weird inversion of the gender roles, which is, I love kids. I've always wanted to be a dad. And when I was like 17, 18, I used to joke, like, when people are like, oh, so what do you want to be when you grow up? I say, I want to be a dad. And
Oh,
ironically, like, that's an incredibly good line with trying to pick up girls. Like, it's, if you're trying to, like, like, just like sleep around, like, if you can demonstrate, like, wow, I'm a really paternal, caring person, they'll be like, oh my God, yeah. I myself don't want to have kids because being a mother is a form of sexist oppression, etc. But like, and so you have this inversion where it's become okay for men to cry, I think, in a certain way, for men to cry about certain things, and it's become not okay for women to cry about them, right? This is, bearing children has basically always been, right? Like, your ability to have children as a person has been one of the most defining elements of humanity, and the inability to do it is basically, it's like the number one source of pain. You read the Bible and you'll find no character, that there's nothing that is more important than having children. And
absolutely.
I think one of the things I love about this poem is there's a tradition in English poetry called the Carpe Diem poem, which I'm sure you've heard of, Liza. But for those of you who haven't heard of it, it's a poem that just basically says, seize the day, live boldly. And the traditional form of this poem for like a Renaissance writer was basically like, you, young virgin woman, seize the day by giving your virginity to me now, right?
Yeah.
And what you've done here is you've actually kind of inverted that, right? There's this sort of seize the day element, but the seizing of the day is not towards, sex or towards pleasure or towards even business. It's actually, it's almost the opposite. You're going towards seizing this tradition. Um, I'm curious kind of how that felt for you, or if that's operating here at all, or if that's maybe just something I was picking up on.
No, I mean, I think that's I so so for those who are unfamiliar, so Shakespeare's sonnets, which I love, I mentioned the sonnet earlier. He has a series of kind of 140 or so
150.
sonnets. The first 12 are Shakespeare addressing this young man, or the narrator addressing this young man. And my college professor said that the poems were gay because of this, which I am disinclined to believe. But it is an older man addressing a young man, and he basically says that you have this youth, you're blessed with this youth, but your youth is not going to last forever. So it is your duty to bear children and to make children, and that is how you achieve immortality. He's basically drawing on an argument from the Symposium, which is why I brought up Plato earlier, where um one of the
Just
characters
sorry
in
for anyone who doesn't know, Plato, fourth century Greek philosopher, considered the father of Western philosophy. The Symposium is a work about what is love and what is happiness.
that's right. So in the Symposium, there's this character, her name is Diotima. And she talks a lot about immortality. She says essentially that love is the only way that we can achieve immortality. She says there are two ways that human beings have historically achieved immortality through love. There is love of the mind, which is art, right? So we create artistic work based on this kind of passion that we have, right? And that art, as is the case with Plato, with Shakespeare, outlives us. The second one is love of just erotic love, eros. And she says the way that we create mortality that way is by bearing children. So we fall in love with another person. We have kids. Um, and I think that's the spirit I wanted to capture in this poem is this idea of childbirth. And childbirth comes up. It's kind of been on my mind. I'm 28. It's been on my mind lately. I just got
No,
engaged,
you
so
Mazel
it's
tov. Congratulations on your
thank you,
engagement.
thank
Can we
you.
see, can we see the ring? Psh, wow, Mazel tov. Wonderful.
So, yeah, I got engaged a couple months ago, so that's on my mind. So a lot of these poems, I think, explore childbirth, especially some of the later poems. I have a poem that explicitly explores that theme, which is called "Baby's Little Me," which we can talk about in a second as well. But I think I was very consciously operating within this Plato Shakespeare tradition when writing Farmer's Market. Of you know, that's part of the way that we preserve ourselves is through bearing children, and that's part of the way that we express love for one another.
Right. And it's interesting. The word eros in Greek means the love of beauty, right? We think of
That's right.
erotic love as
Yeah.
being sexual love, but it's actually a sort of a love and a worship and an appreciation of beauty. And I've always been sort of fascinated by the intersection of artistic creation and of procreation or sexual creation, which is both of them require an attraction to something that one finds aesthetically pleasing. And both
That's
of
right.
them like cause you to change your ethics. When aesthetics is visual, basically the evaluation of visuals and of how things look or sound, and ethics is the evaluation of are these things good or not, right? And so when you have children, it change like you are aesthetically attracted to someone, you have children with them, now you have kids and you have to change your ethical framework, right? And in some like,
Absolutely.
basically having children and creating art are two of they're tied together in this kind of act of creation. Have you been thinking about that at all, like in this kind of
I
framework?
have. Yeah. I mean, that's I have an essay actually that's called "On Art and Immortality" on my Substack, where I basically explore
Her
um
Substack is called
that
Pens and
theme.
Poison, by the way.
That's right. And it's actually, so I tried to read the Symposium when I was 12 because I think I was going through my like first whatever crush in school. And I was very interested in this idea of love, and so
So you decided to read a
so I decided to read the
2,500-year-old.
Symposium.
Right. Yeah. The first time I had a crush on a girl, I decided to watch 10 Things I Hate About You. So I guess there's two ways to do it.
So I did that again, didn't understand much of it, reread it in college, got most of it. But I think that idea of like artistic creation and creation of another human being is word for word basically diatima in the Symposium. So definitely worth checking out for any listeners who are interested in that theme. So it's been an age old theme that again Shakespeare explores, and I think the kind of overlap between art and childbirth has always been there because fundamentally, as Plato tells us, it's this love of beauty that draws both of those in. And I think to me, I always talk about my most recent novel that I wrote, explores this idea of like, kind of what is beauty with the capital B sense. And that's always been something that has interested me, and we've been talking about it since the Platonic days. So it's definitely themes that I like to explore in my writing for sure.
And speaking of that, in thinking about the artistic creation and childbirth, writing a book is very similar to giving birth. Having never given birth, I feel very confident that I can make that claim. I've written several books. All of them were excruciating experiences that caused my weight to change pretty frequently. Uh,
Okay, I like that analogy. I'll let you know when I have kids in a couple years. I'll let you know how
Please do.
similar they.
Yeah, yeah. We'll bring you back on while you're in the delivery room so we can get kind of
That's
the
right.
play by play. But tell us, how was it for you? Is this your first publication?
Yeah, so I have a couple other poetry books. They're I would say just I wrote them before I have had an audience of any sort. Really, I don't think anyone's really read them. So I have had experience doing this, but I really think that this is kind of my what I would like to consider my like authorial debut in many ways because I feel like the other poems I wrote kind of like in college, they're maybe a little bit more juvenile. I think this is probably the first collection where I like sit down and explore themes, right? So
Mm,
I think, yeah, it was a fun experience, but definitely very excruciating and difficult. As I said somewhere on my Substack, I took a lot of tears, both of joy and sadness, to get through this poem or poetry collection.
right, right. And talk to me a little bit about the decision to self-publish as opposed to going kind of the traditional publishing route.
Yeah, so I am trying to go to the traditional route with my novels still. I think the answer is very simple. Most agents just don't want to look at poetry books at all. So I think I rather than wait to get, a novel deal and then have a novel come out that's gonna take a couple of years and then maybe they'll publish my poetry book. I was like, you know what? I These poems I think are timely. I think they represent me at this stage of my life. Who knows what I'm gonna think in 5 years? So gotta get it out now.
Absolutely. And how has it felt now that you have gotten them out?
Yeah, I mean, I think I I have people reading the book. I have some people who, message me saying, "I'm really excited to read this. Thank you so much." I think it's really cool to have kind of my love of beauty in other people's hands. So it's a little bit daunting, but I think, it's been a really, really fantastic experience, and just, hearing feedback from people who have said, "Oh, I really resonated with this poem," has just been, absolutely wonderful.
It's great. I selfishly, I'm asking because I also have a collection of poetry that I've finished and been trying to figure out what's the best way to go about publishing it. Do I self-publish it? My first, I basically went the opposite route of you, which was like I really want physical copies of it. I don't care if anyone reads it, so I
Sure.
took it to a printer in LA and I just had like
Ah,
copies printed, and then don't tell anybody, but I've been secretly putting them in those little free libraries around the city, and I keep having this.
that's good. I love
It's
that.
it's my fantasy basically is that there will be someone who then gets this book and is like, oh my God, this is life changing poetry.
Oh,
Um,
I love that. Yeah, I mean, I
and
think, um, there's another Substacker apparently bought my book, which I'm, very grateful for, and he's a teacher, and he had written that, he, left the book in the school library, and his hope is that, a young girl will pick up the poems and be inspired, and I thought that was just a very sweet thing, to say, and that's, I think that's the best thing that I can ever hope for as a writer is someone will pick up some of my thoughts and resonate with them, and then they'll in turn want to create their own thoughts and bring their own beauty into the world. And I think that that's, you know, fundamentally what poetry and writing, by extension, is all about, is just bringing a new sense of beauty in the world.
right, and also being a part of this tradition that you mentioned Eliot and just Plath, Eliot, Keats, Shakespeare. None of these people could have existed without the other ones. Not, nor could you and I. Right, our ability to understand the world as we do be meaningless without Shakespeare. And
Absolutely.
so something we were actually talking about before we started recording is about how much reading and writing make your life better and more beautiful, and how sad it is that so many people don't appreciate these things anymore.
Oh, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing I can do is I always try to I work with students full time, and I always try to at least bring up we don't do, like,
sorry, in what
English.
capacity?
Yeah, so I do college counseling, for students, and, we're just sitting there editing college essays that probably ChatGPT wrote, but, even though we're not doing anything English related, I'd still like to bring up I'll bring up Drobel's essays, and I'll say, "Hey, here's, an example of a great personal essay," and that's kind of directly relevant. Sometimes I'll bring up, a book I've read. There are some college essay prompts that sometimes ask, like, "Tell us about a book you've read," and then there's an opportunity to talk a little bit about literature to the kids. But one thing that I do get a chance to talk about is just how important writing is, and, that the kids kind of see that they're going through college essays now, they realize they need to write. And even though a lot of them do it with ChatGPT, if I even convince 1 or 2 kids that writing is important, I will feel as if I've done a great job in the world.
Excellent. All right. So then here's my question for you. Convince
Sure.
me that writing is important.
Oh my, okay, let's do it. So, I think the number one thing with writing is it is a proxy for thinking. What do I mean by that? Through writing, we are able to most clearly and effectively communicate our ideas. And I think if you can demonstrate that you are able to coherently write down your thoughts, you will then in turn demonstrate to the world that you are a strong thinker. There's no use basically just of having thoughts floating in your head. And sure, you can explain them orally. But I think through writing is how we can develop our thoughts. I'm sometimes writing something and then I'll get this like new thought that I didn't even have before. And I think it's the act of writing itself causes your brain to think in ways that I don't think it thinks in any other capacity except for maybe reading, which is very similar. And I think if you want to persuade people, right? We talk about, the art of kind of rhetoric, right? Cicero talks about the art of rhetoric.
Cicero was
Aristotle.
a Roman politician and writer and fantastic orator. He literally wrote the textbook on how to win an argument. It's
That's
called
right.
De Oratory.
Cicero, yes, talks phenomenally about that, and he's playing off of broader tradition from Aristotle, who also talks about kind of persuasion, and language. So,
Aristotle was a Greek philosopher and a student of Plato.
right, yeah. So, and I think a lot of all of that coming together is this idea that you can demonstrate that you're a strong thinker, but you can also persuade people of your idea. And that's why I love writing essays because, I have an idea. I write a lot of maybe kind of controversial out there essays because I have a lot of maybe unorthodox thoughts, at least for a young Gen Z woman. And so my goal with writing is to persuade, at least present a thought of, here's what I'm all about and here's why I want to, give you this idea. And I think you can only really do that through writing. And I think just more on a more practical level, um, strong writers are strong communicators, and strong communicators are also tend to be more creative thinkers. I mean, if you care about, let's say, leveling up in like the corporate world, if you look at the top like successful people or CEOs, they're all very strong thinkers and they all have creativity. And they know how to express themselves, right? They can gain influence by this medium of expression. And I think writing has so much to do with that. It forces your mind to think creatively. It allows you to communicate your ideas and persuade the people around you. So I think that we've really underestimated the power of the creative thinker in our society, and I think it's really unfortunate because if you really go to the top of like success in Western societies, it's always the creative thinkers on top, like, bar none, basically. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And it's sort of strange, but I remember growing up, like people took thinking for granted as something that all human beings do. And I would say that in my day-to-day life now, I experience probably 5 to 10% of the people I interact with who actually think. meaning there's a thought that is generated from inside of them that then comes out, as opposed to what I think has really happened a lot. And I've been actually working on an essay about this, which is that there's so much social pressure to believe what everyone else believes that I think we've become terrified of actually having unique thoughts, especially for men, which is like, if you don't, at any time, basically, you can be canceled for anything you say. It's not
Yeah.
clear where the line is. Um, and the metaphor I've been sort of thinking of is like, if you had a recording of anything that was said in a middle school boys' locker room, every single man in the world would be canceled. Like middle school boys, just the most depraved, but they say what they're thinking, right? And
Yeah.
as a society, we hope, okay, they will eventually learn that these things are wrong and they'll make that determination for themselves. But I think what's happened is because people are so afraid of, whatever you say is going to get carried with you, if it's recorded, whatever, right and wrong for yourself, right? It becomes extremely difficult to actually have a thought if you're terrified of thought.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. I, completely agree with that. And I think you have this kind of homogenization of thoughts, possibly because we don't write anymore. We don't teach people to really learn how to write or value writing in any way. And I think writing is probably the only way that you can discover what you actually think. And I also know this because I work with students. Many of them have no idea what their value systems are, and sure, they're young, they're like 17, but I think by 17 you should have a general idea, like what you stand for, what you believe in. Maybe not fully fleshed out, a general maybe direction. And so many of the kids I work with just have no freaking idea what they stand for, what their belief systems are. And I think through writing, we're able to at least bring a little bit of that out. And I think if, even if you don't care about the societal kind of value of writing, just for yourself, writing is one of the ways in which you can really identify what you stand for and how you can basically piece together the, facets of your identity.
right. And I like what you're saying about the value system. The way I sort of think about it is when you're 17, you need to have the bookcase of your values. You can change the books as you grow, right? And you should. But you need to know that there is a bookcase in your mind where you are storing all of your values. And every day you wake up and you have the same values you had the day before. My
Yeah.
concern basically is that what's happened in modernity is, along with all of the physical bookcases being replaced by the internet, basically the moral bookcase has been as well. And so in order for most people to figure out what are my values today, they go on Instagram to see what other people are talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's certainly an erosion of kind of value systems. And last time you and I spoke, we talked a little bit about the publishing industry. And I've been writing a lot about the publishing industry as I like to do. And one of the things that I have a sort of half baked essay in mind about is this idea that a lot of books that are being published today kind of lack a set system of morality. And I think that kind of goes along with this idea of, we're operating this like post value, postmodern world where everything is kind of nihilistic and meaningless. And I think a great example of that is there's this literary fiction author named Atessa Moshfegh, who's I would say probably one of the most popular kind of literary fiction authors of today. And her most popular book, it's called My Year of Rest and Relaxation, um, which I ended up reading because I I wanted to have an example of a book that was just very nihilistic and kind of anti-value system. And the book is just it's very hedonistic. I think its core message is that kind of nothing matters. Kind of human relationships are empty. um the the job world is empty, meaning is empty, nothing means anything, so you should just sleep and hibernate all your life basically. And that's kind of the takeaway that even the book kind of doesn't mean much, is that there's kind of no more meaning in anything. And I think Atessa is okay with that. She says that's just kind of how the world is, right? And to me, that is emblematic of how we think about the world today. What goes on in publishing, I think, mirrors, what people are thinking, is that we've just kind of lost the system of, finding meaning. I always think of the famous book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. He's a Holocaust survivor who wrote about kind of the what motivates man is to find meaning in his life. And I think that is fundamentally true. I think that life is meaningful. I think systems of morality help us learn how to live the best life. And I think that that is what makes most great literature great is this idea of finding meaning, finding morality, finding, what is the good life? And contemporary books, I think, lack that because we've fully done away with value systems. We've done away with meaning, and everything is just kind of postmodern and nihilistic. And I think that's probably a really good symptom of the decay of our society today because to me, I'm very much in the Frankel camp of I want to live my life trying to figure out what this all means, right? We're here. We need to find something that kind of motivates us, that drives us. And for some people that's kind of love, bearing children. For some people that's work. For some people that's kind of courage through suffering. That's kind of what Frankel says, at least. And again, that's been completely eroded by the publishing world. And I think that that's kind of, it's embedded in the books that we read today. And I think it's really unfortunate because it's teaching so many young people that, meaning is relative, morality is relative, nothing means anything anymore. And it's causing a lot of people to adopt this nihilistic mindset. And I think that's why we also see some very high rates of like depression, suicide, that sort of thing, because we have convinced people that nothing is worth anything. And that to me is not the right move.
Right. Right. I think it was Oscar Wilde who once said, a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I think as a society, I mean, even using like having children as an example, right? Every single young woman knows the price of childbirth. I don't think a single one of them, okay, I'm speaking very hyperbolically. Very few of them could tell you what the value is. Um, and well, I want to I want to go deeper into this idea that you're talking about with Viktor Frankl because it's actually a very important part of what this podcast, This Way Up, is about. So this podcast was started basically out of my frustration with the constant downward mobility of all things. Like I'm from Los Angeles. The movie industry has been making terrible movies for the past 15 years. Everyone's like, why is no one going to the movies? Because the movies are bad. The students are getting worse. The like books are getting worse, music is getting worse, society is getting worse. You feel it all the time. If you don't feel this downward trend that I'm talking about, please message me whatever it is that you're smoking. I would love to try some. This is pretty ubiquitous, right? Everywhere you go, everyone's like, okay, things are going down. So I'm saying I'm putting my feet in the ground saying, no, there's a way up, right? And the way up is through exactly what you're talking about, which is through meaning. That life is fundamentally meaningful. There probably is not one set meaning to life, and so this is why let's talk about Viktor Frankl here. So for our listeners who don't know, Viktor Frankl was a therapist following the about a generation or two generations after Sigmund Freud, or I should put it differently. He was a very young man when Freud was an old man, both of whom were affected by the Holocaust in different ways. And Viktor Frankl puts forward, when you think about Freud, you think about basically, you say man's search for life has to do with his libido, right? You think about Freud and you think about the Freudian complex, sexuality, all of these types of things. Uh, and so there's man's drive for pleasure, which is kind of Freudian. There's man's drive for power, which is Nietzschean, which is the idea that kind of underpins Nazism and a lot of other modern sort of ideas. And then Viktor Frankl comes out with a completely different perspective, which he says, no, man is actually seeking meaning in this world. And this quest for meaning is the only thing that matters in terms of determining someone's happiness or unhappiness. And essentially that if the type of therapy he does is called logotherapy, which is that if you can line up your life with the center of meaning in your life, you'll be happy, more or less. And his proof of this is pretty profound, which is that when he gets taken to Auschwitz, he hides the manuscript of Man's Search for Meaning in his coat. And the Nazis take the coat from him and they throw it with all of the other coats. And he starts sobbing and he's trying to get his coat. And the Nazi looks at him and goes, "You stupid Jew, you care so much about a coat. Here, take this one." And he throws him a different coat. And obviously, the Nazi can't understand what this man has lost, nor does the Nazi care, right? Because the Nazi couldn't possibly care about the emotions of Jewish people. And I actually think that the comfortability and the ubiquitousness of anti Semitism is very much tied to this lack of meaning. And we'll get to that in the second part of this podcast. Um, but what Frankel then does is he says, "I can't die in Auschwitz. I have to write my book again." And it's his desire to write this book again that is what keeps him alive. And so, as we're thinking about, you and I are both poets. I imagine that you had the similar experience to me when you told people that you were a poet, when they were like, "Oh, so what do you really do?" Um, is how does poetry and writing and art, maybe art more broadly, how does that help us find meaning in this world? And do you think there's a possibility for us to use art to restore meaning in a lot of these places where we've lost it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's actually the novel that I mentioned that I'm just finished recently that I'm trying to get out into the world is basically about restoring meaning through art. So interesting that you bring that up. So I'll talk a little bit about that because I think it's relevant here. So there's this book by
Can we know what it's called, by the way?
Sure, it's
Or is
called
that
the Leverkusen Quartet, which I'll explain in a second. So there's this book by Thomas Mann called Dr. Faustus, and it's essentially a retelling of the age-old Faust myth in the context of 20th century Germany.
first
Um,
popularized by Christopher Marlowe, I believe?
that's right. Yeah, so there's Marlowe's Faust and there's Goethe's Faust is probably the most famous one. And then Mann comes in and writes Dr. Faustus, which is his kind of retelling of the Faustus myth within the context of the rise of Nazi Germany.
And can you remind us just quickly of the what is the Faustus myth?
Yeah, so basically, fundamentally, the Faustus myth is there's this young scholar named Faust, and there are various versions of it, but probably the most famous version is he seeks eternal youth. Well, there's one version that's eternal youth. There's one version that's kind of infinite knowledge. He seeks this kind of something greater than man has itself. There's a lot of kind of hubris embedded in this. So he strikes a deal with the devil, and the devil basically says, "I'll give you, youth, but your soul is going to be eternally damned." And he says, "Okay, fine, I'll do it." And then obviously the rest of the story is about the pitfalls of creating that sort of Faustian
The
bargain.
Faustian bargain, exactly.
That's right. In the Mann version, there's this composer named Adrian Leverkühn, who just my book is named after, who decides he's going to be there is an encounter with the devil, but it's unclear if Leverkusen is just hallucinating the devil or if it's there's actually a devil in the novel. Unclear. But he talks to the devil and he realizes that his you know search for this kind of artistic obsession comes at a certain cost. So he becomes probably the most famous composer of the era. It's fictional, but in that world, he becomes the most famous composer. Everyone knows him. He writes this beautiful music, but there's a cost to this artistic creation. And basically, in the end, he kind of goes crazy in various ways. And he sacrifices love and relationships, and he's basically just a loner for the whole book. There's a lot. You can also read the book as an allegory for the rise of Nazi Germany. Um, and so there's a lot of different elements of kind of, again, the search for meaning and what is the cost of art, right? So I read that book about a year ago and it just fully changed my life. And the novel's character, Adrian Leverkusen, the protagonist, reminded me of an old composer friend of mine who I think had a very similar psyche to Adrian Leverkusen. And so I had this idea to write a novel that was a retelling of kind of very, very loose retelling of Mann's novel set within the 21st century that explores kind of the cost of artistic obsession in contemporary New York, but also explores Jewish themes because, Bond was not Jewish. He was very sympathetic to the kind of the Jewish strife in the 20th century. So I think that inspired the kind of Jewish themes as well. So I kind of look at both Jewish themes and I look at the cost of artistic obsession. And the reason I bring this up is there's this moment in um, Mann's Dr. Faustus where Adrian Leverkühn he writes this piece called the Lament of Dr. Faustus, or the Lament of Faustus. And he basically says that with this piece, I will undo the Ninth Symphony. And of course, by that, and he just says it like that in the book. Of course, by that he means Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, if you remember, explodes in joy. It erupts in joy in the very last movement, in the famous Ode to Joy. So what Leverkühn does is through a piece of art, he basically strips the world of joy. He says that if the moment that I write this and that this piece gets out into the world, I will undo the Ninth Symphony. And he says it very cryptically. So it becomes a metaphor for kind of how art has the power to kind of sway the world in one way or the other. And obviously that's then the undoing of joy is a metaphor for the rise of Nazi Germany. So, in my book, I take the opposite approach, where my character says that he's going to undo Leverkuhn's undoing of the Ode to Joy through a piece that he writes called Reversion, which is in a reversion like a bringing back to the original, and it's kind of an exploration of how art can bring joy back into the world, and create meaning in the world, whether art should have that power and where else we can find kind of beauty and meaning. And the kind of conclusion that the protagonist comes to at the end is that art is one way of doing that, but we can also find beauty and meaning in the ordinary world, and that there's kind of meaning everywhere. You just have to kind of look for it. So I think that that's something that we're missing today as a generation is this kind of fundamental search for meaning and just being able to find meaning in ordinary things and being able to, look to art to meaning or just look to, human relationships as we've discussed, or look to just, an afternoon at the beach. And just find meaning in kind of everything that we do rather than approaching the world nihilistically.
Right. I think that's so well said that it's not, meaning doesn't have to be this big metaphysical concept of like, oh my God, everything in life is about this one thing. Meaning can just be like, you know what the meaning is of a good morning for me? It's a nice cup of coffee because thank God, like I did nothing to earn the experience of drinking coffee, right? I didn't make the beans. I didn't farm it. I just get to enjoy it. And it's actually something I learned. I taught for a couple of years in a very religious yeshiva, and I learned it from my students because they would essentially pray and thank God for all of these little things in their life, and I could see in their eyes how much more beautiful their world was than mine, because every single thing for them was a representation of a gift from the creator of the universe. And eventually, and I had a very this is sort of my like come to Jesus moment, although obviously not Jesus, but basically I like you, I work in college, not college admissions, but essentially in helping kids navigate college admissions as a tutor and as a college counselor and all of that stuff. And so I had this experience where I was teaching in the yeshiva, and my students were so happy, right? They were like, they were slacking off in class. They never listened to me. They would talk when I was talking, but like, they were happy, healthy, mentally well kids. And then I got called by one of my old clients to help her son write an essay. And she basically tells me right before I start working with him, he doesn't need any help with the actual material. However, he went to the number 1 private school in Los Angeles, Harvard Westlake.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard of it.
We have clients from Harvard Westlake. Yes, I'm
Okay.
aware.
So, unfortunately, she says 2 of the students in his class this have committed suicide this month, and it's, sui childhood suicide is probably the most under talked about issue in America right now. We're hemorrhaging kids, and it's
Yeah.
heartbreaking. And you can't really come up with a reason why a 15-year-old would be killing themselves except something that has changed in the past 150 years, right? It never
Yeah.
happened before. And so for me, what happens is I teach this kid and I'm affected and I'm very upset. And then I come in the next day to the yeshiva and I see these 15-year-old boys who are smiling, they're happy, they're easygoing, right? This set of Talmud behind me, one of my students worked in a Judaica store, and he comes to me and he goes, Mr. Goldstein, I can get you a good deal on Shas if you want it. And he was like, but you have to let me use my phone during class. And I was like, okay. I probably shouldn't have done it, but you know what? I wanted, I mean, hey, it's a good deal. Um, and so what I learned from my students, and I actually changed my life as a result of this. I basically said, they're smarter than me. Whatever they're doing, I'm going to start doing. And it was little things like every time I see a mezuzah, I touch it and I kiss it. Because now it's like, oh, there are more things in my life that are worth kissing, right? You only kiss things that you care about, right? And so like it's these little things. So I think that the way that we approach life needs to be meaning focused and it needs to be joy focused. And I think we actually learn how to experience joy from children. And I think that's why what you're saying about going back to farmers market and this kind of inversion of carpe diem and thinking about seizing the day, maybe actually being about motherhood and chasing that. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And that my favorite line, it's probably my favorite line in the whole collection, if I'm being honest, but definitely in this poem is, one second, might I be too selfish, fatalistic? Dare I reenact the Edens of my youth? And I wrote that. I was actually upset when I wrote. I know something is a good line if it upsets me because that means I'm jealous that I didn't write it. It's an excellent line because I think what you're really capturing here is the idyllic Eden-like sense that we all have when we think of our childhoods. Even if, for me, that was where I went to camp. I think I'm curious, what is that image of Eden that comes to your mind? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of as I've mentioned, there's a lot of kind of childhood, like, innocence embedded, in the book. There's this, again, poem, I Have Babies, Little Me. There's, Indigo Arcadia, which I think is just this, like, idyllic poem that kind of brings us back again to childhood. I think for me, love has always been embedded with kind of this return to childhood. I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting to me when I met my fiance, he reminded me of what it was like when I was a kid. And I think that was just really, really special to me of just, kind of watching these like little Russian cartoons, that Soviet cartoons that I grew up with, or just this kind of experience of just having, pre-technology day. Obviously, there was technology, but pre days where everyone had an iPhone of just like play, or just kind of spending time with, you know, loved ones basically in like my apartment or just tumbling down like a little hill, which is where I got the idea for Indigo Arcadia. I have there's this little hill outside of my preschool. And I like to just kind of roll down it when I was 4 years old. And I think that I very much, as many poets do, I very much associate kind of childhood with like this idyllic, like Eden garden world. And I think it just, reminds me of that, like tumbling down that hill, and obviously falling has always been an age-old metaphor for kind of losing innocence, that sort of thing. But just like tumbling kind of innocently as a child, I think that that's what I associate with childhood. And a lot of the poems in here, I think, bring back love into the childhood sphere because to me, love has always been this kind of return to the kind of innocent world. And I think part of the reason, and not just my fiance, but sort of every single time I felt just kind of very emotionally invested in someone, there's been some sort of recall of my childhood, and I think that's true for a lot of people that maybe we don't talk about as much, but I think, there's a sense of like safety. I feel really safe with my fiance. He makes me feel like I can just be a little kid around him, right? And I think that that's why I think childhood is so powerful. And we want to kind of return to childhood. And again, coming back to this idea of bearing children, that's best way that we can do so, falling in love and bearing kids.
Right. I that's such a tender image of you kind of tumbling down this hill and then also finding your fiance and sort of he creates the park of a childhood park for you to exist in. Before I forget though, the Soviet cartoons, I'm fascinated by these. What are Soviet cartoons like?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I I think that was one of the first things that my fiance and I ever talked about when we met is Soviet cartoons, and I immediately just we had this, like, moment of connection of, "Oh my god, this person understands my childhood." So there's a bunch, the most famous one is probably called Cheburashka that people know about,
I'm
it's
not going to
about
try to spell that one for you
yeah,
guys.
so
Good
you
luck.
probably know it because a lot of people have interpreted it as a metaphor for Judaism. There's this, kind of strange animal figure. He looks kind of like a Soviet Labubu, maybe. um, and he has these kind of big ears and he's brown. And it's not really clear what sort of animal he is, and he doesn't really fit in to the society, which is maybe metaphor for kind of the Jewish people in the Soviet world. And this kind of nice crocodile friend takes him in. And kind of introduces him to the world. And obviously, there's a little bit of like Soviet propaganda. There's this one, I rewatched it as an adult, and there's this one line where like everyone says like we like worked together and then we built this like house. And like there's a lot of that embedded in it. It's like fine, whatever. But I think fundamentally, to me, the cartoon Chiburashka has always been about belonging. And I've always felt like an outsider in so many spaces from from Jewish background to like Soviet background. And I think that those cartoons just really remind me that I do have a place in this world and that there's a lot of just like childhood innocence embedded in it. And I think the Soviet Union obviously did police art, but I think with policing art, there comes a little bit more of like an innocent, like all Soviet films are very wholesome. And I think there's a downside to that, but I think that's also maybe not necessarily a bad thing because I think again, our society is very nihilistic and just watching these kind of old Soviet cartoons, old kind of Soviet films gives me a sense of, there's just kind of some goodness in the world.
There's something really funny about listening to a Jewish child of Soviet immigrants say that Soviet cartoons remind them that there's a sense of innocence and beauty in the world. Uh, which is it's for me, like I think that God has a great sense of humor, and that's kind of just that's a great display of it because you see like there's this really it's a very funny, but also very tender nostalgia for the old Soviet Union from especially from, like, Soviet Jews who are like, "Oh, man, everything was terrible, it was so bad." But some things were so weird, they were so strange that you they were just, like, hysterical. I have
Yeah.
a friend, he's in his 60s, I believe, so he grew up in the Soviet Union. He has a collection of what he calls artifacts of Soviet weirdness. And they're like things that like medal for the student in class who was the best at cleaning the bathroom, like things like that. Uh,
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah. I
are
mean, I think there's part of maybe the Soviet spirit is also finding like little moments of goodness because obviously my family suffered through a lot and I know so many other Soviet families have as well. So I think part of the way that we cope is finding these like nice wholesome little nuggets of goodness and wholesomeness because that's the only way to survive.
right, and there were some everyone was suffering in the Soviet Union, so it's not like no one would be like, "Oh my god, you're supporting Soviet voices by watching this cartoon." It's like, "No, comrade, like, we're all suffering, we're just trying to feel a little bit better." Uh
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I obviously draw a lot on my background, in my writing, so the novel that I mentioned is follows a kind of Russian Jewish character. The previous novel I wrote, I tried to focus a little bit less on identity in that novel, sort of as a rebellion because I think so many novels today focus about identity. But I in the most recent novel, I felt like I had to put that at the forefront because I think it's just such a central part of who I am and how I think about the world. I think so much of my value system has been informed by, my parents' background, my parents' maybe rather unfortunate background. So I think that that's something that I explore in my poems and my writing, and it'll always just be a fundamental part of who I am.
Absolutely. And I think that would actually be a great segue for us. We're going to move into the second part of the podcast now, where we talk about Judaism, Zionism, poetry, literature, all of that good stuff. We'll take a short commercial break, um, and we'll be back in a few. All right, welcome back, everybody, to This Way Up. I'm Ted Goldstein, talking with Lisa Libes, and now we're moving on to part two, poetry, Judaism, and Zionism. So, I think I was pretty inspired by that story you opened up with about your 7th grade middle school teacher and the snowman. So what I think we should do is I'd like you to read Yellow for us right now. And that we'll start with that, just the poem.
All right. Okay.
And by the way, this is the first poem in Girl Soldier. I guess it's not the titular poem. I don't know what the word is for the opening poem.
Suppose it's the opening poem.
I suppose it's the opening
It's the
poem.
first poem. All right. Okay. Let's read Yellow. On the evening of the Pesach, we were piled into Uncle Asher's scarlet Lexus, breathing through the grape juice scented whiff of that old pipe I never liked much as a kid, but which reminded me of Seder celebrations and the matzahs that my father always hid in the apartment when the Seder meant you couldn't eat the challah. My cousins had a group of kids, the darling boys, a year apart, girls dressed in tutu skirts, and the oldest, on the eve of his bar mitzvah, Max. That evening, on their doorstep, we had gathered wishes on the blue mezuzah, and my father donned his kippah. Max was in Cologne to woo the girls at school, and Uncle Asher drank the wine alone, the preferred beverage of the evening, grape juice. We arranged the Seder plate and lost the bone, but to the dog, and Aunt Adina hid the matzahs in the yard for all the kids to find. Someone complained that Max was in the game, but he was not yet a bar mitzvah, so it was conceded, and anyway he lost, likely by his own design. Max was in a Star of David and a yellow kippah, which had fallen somewhere in the yard while he was running. Nevertheless, the evening carried on, and Uncle Asher gave him a replacement, reading in blue letters like the blue mezuzah, "Never again." And I am sure he knew the implications. We heard the newscast ringing from the TV. Today, they were not letting Jews on campus. I thought it was a joke the news had played. And we were not yet through the prayers when Max exclaimed, "They want us dead." And Uncle Asher said, "Who needs these clowns?" And Aunt Adina said, "They'll be arrested." And my dad said, "Yes. But we are just celebrating eating matzah, sitting as a family together, just like other families. What have we done wrong?" In the yard, I found the yellow kippah, and it reminded me of Yellow Star.
Mm. In the yard, I found the yellow kippah, and it reminded me of yellow stars. Such a powerful way to end this opening poem. And I guess my first question is, was this a real Seder?
Yeah, so it was inspired by kind of a real Pesach. I kind of made up the names and the characters, but in the April 2024, which if you will remember your recent event history, was when the campus protests were happening around US
And it was
colleges that started at my alma mater, Columbia University.
and yeah, we need to give a special shout out to Columbia University and the Students for Justice in Palestine in Columbia. They don't get enough credit. The Students for Justice in Palestine chapter reopened just before October 7th, and they were basically fully ready to shut the entire university down immediately. It's almost like they knew about the attacks beforehand. Like that's how on top of it they were. Columbia, right? I think a lot of people, especially from Los Angeles, like me, and from California, we all thought Berkeley was the most anti-Semitic school in the country. You guys really
No,
took the
it's
cake.
yeah.
And just also one quick thing. April 2024, that was the first Pesach when we had hostages in Gaza. Pesach is the celebration of our liberation from Egypt and also the beginning of our journey towards Israel. And that was the first Pesach when we had hostages who were being held captive in Gaza.
That's right. So it was a heavy one. I'm We went to my aunt and uncle. We went to their relatives. And it was my uncle who had married into our family. So we went to relatives who I was not blood related to, but who was kind of part of my extended family. So I didn't know a lot of them. So there were a lot of strangers. There's this kind of giant house in the suburbs. There were about maybe like 30 or 40 people there. And we were kind of gathered there. Started off kind of like a normal pace. Like we had talked a little bit about the Columbia stuff that had been happening in the car ride on the way out to the suburbs. But my aunt and uncle were obviously very annoyed by my alma mater. And there was this kind of group of kids there. And they were kind of ranging from ages like 2 to 13, and there was the older one, um, who Max is inspired by, and he, was getting old enough to kind of sense that something was wrong. Obviously, the 2-year-olds maybe didn't really understand what was going on, and we had kind of the TV in the background, and they had started to talk about the campus protests, and Max, the character that Max was based on, the person that Max was based on, could have just started asking questions about like, "Oh, what's going on?" Like,
This is
um,
the 13-year-old who's almost bar
yeah, the
mitzvah age.
13-year-old. So he was the kind of the oldest kid there. And my kind of extended family was talking to him in various ways about, some of them I think were trying to kind of shield him from what was happening. Some of them I think were giving him like more direct answers. My dad actually wasn't here. I made up the fact that my dad was here, or that the narrator's dad. But I think my dad is kind of known as being the most kind of blunt, direct human in the family. So I had the dad kind of
A
in this.
Jewish Russian man who's blunt and
That's right.
direct. He must be the only one.
Yeah. um. So just very straightforwardly, the dad in the poem says, yes, they want us dead. That's kind of what's going on here. And I think there was a lot of talk from various like Jewish outlets that what was happening on campuses was kind of resembling what happened in the kind of early days of, the Third Reich, where, Jews were being barred from entering campus. I think at UCLA, they were not letting Jews into like a certain library. Um, and I think that just on the car ride home, I just started to think about the way that these little kids were having to live through this. I, as a child, had never really experienced any sort of anti-Semitism. I think because I didn't really see it as a huge part of my identity growing up until I started to gradually learn more about my family's history. Um, and I think it just really struck me that these kids are going to grow up in a completely different kind of Jewish world, or completely different world for a Jewish person than I had grown up in, where my parents had basically fled the Soviet Union to escape anti-Semitism. And these little kids, these little 2-year-olds, 5-year-olds, whatnot, were going to have to grow up in a world where, everything had changed for the Jews all of a sudden after October 7th. And I think I wanted to kind of create this parallel that, we as Jewish people are very sensitive to this idea of kind of Jewish persecution. We feel it on another level, and I think most of society doesn't. And so I wanted to, obviously the yellow stars are the kind of the Jewish identifications that were worn in the kind of Nazi era Germany. And so obviously we're not, thank thank God we're not living in that world, but I do think that there are some striking parallels, and we need to just be very wary of, what where the world is going, because I don't think that this is something to be taken lightly.
Absolutely. I mean, you're certainly preaching to the choir here. And, I think I think we all everyone in our generation basically had the anachronistic privilege of growing up without anti-Semitism. And this is something I talk about a lot with my parents who, unlike your parents, grew up basically in the greatest place in the world for Jews, which was the second half of the 20th century in New York. And I think for a lot of American Jews, right, my grandparents experienced extreme anti-Semitism. I'm a very rare item in America. I'm a fourth generation Ivy League educated Jew. So my great uncle or great great uncle was the first one. And my grandfather went to Columbia when there was a quote on the number of Jews who could
Oh,
go.
wow.
Right.
Yeah.
So there were, and the most painful thing about everything that's happened is when I was a kid, my grandfather's dream was that I would one day become the first Jewish American president. There was this idea that they had is like, wow, look at what we've come from. His parents fled not Soviet Russia, but Tsarist Russia
Yeah.
because of the Kishinev pogrom, which is the pogroms in Russia were basically an act of political violence against Jews who lived in what was called the Pale of Settlement. And anytime there were political issues with the Russians, they would send the Cossacks, who were like these cavalry soldiers, to go rape, pillage, and murder Jewish people.
Yeah.
Uh, and the story in my family, almost everyone has the story in my family is that my great great grandmother, Gittel, was 2 years old when the Cossacks came into town. And so her father put her in the well for 14 hours. She sat there as a 3 or 4 year
God.
old and she survived. And he said, okay, we're leaving. Right. And so that's what my family came to the US for. And my grandfather experienced, grew up speaking Yiddish. He went to Columbia and he was like, you know what, I'm going to deal with all of this anti-Semitism so that my children, my grandchildren can have a better world. And he passed away in 2014. And to be honest, I feel very grateful that he hasn't had to see what has happened because basically we're right back where we were.
Oh,
And
yeah.
um for I didn't grow up with an anti-Semitism consciousness the way that he did, or the way that Soviet Jews, Mizrahi Jews from Iran or Iraq, or Sephardic Jews from North Africa did. And we kind of talked about this, you and I, last time a little bit, that there's a very big split in the Jewish community in this approach. And one of the things that I really admired in this poem is you've got each of these characters who I think is sort of stands in for someone at the Seder table, right? And it's almost like a modern interpretation of the four sons.
Yeah, so I think each character definitely represents, kind of a different way of interpreting maybe Judaism and the threat, where, kind of Max is this, like, innocent kid who's maybe asking all of the questions, which, Judaism is all about asking questions, as we know, right? So I think he's that stereotypical question answer seeker. And then you have the kind of Uncle Asher character who is, I think, the stereotypical, like, Jewish man figure who maybe is not taking things seriously because he has some sort of trauma. And then you have the kind of the stern Jewish, like, aunt who is, the classic, like, Jewish mother of, like, neuroticism and, like, oh, order, that sort of thing. And then you have the dad who is kind of the man who acknowledges, that this is what it is and this is the reality, and it's bleak for us. So I think those are the kind of the I guess Jewish archetypes that I wanted to put forth in this poem. And I think that a mix of all of those, every Jewish person knows some version of that. And I think every Jewish family has a mix of those
Right.
characters or those people. And I think this is my, stereotypical, like, identity Jewish poem in the book. And I wanted to write it because I think it's important. I've written poems about Judaism in the past, but I think this is probably the most overt kind of political poem. I say I don't like to write the political poems, and I don't write many of them, but I think this was very necessary and very timely.
Right. And this is kind of the unfortunate reality of our world, which is that this poem is actually not political at all. I would say there's not a single political idea in here other than it's scary when people want to kill Jews. That's not a political idea, and it's kind of I mean I the the talons of anti-Zionism are so powerful that like they've perverted our ability to think about anything. And one of the ways I realize this most clear is if you're ever talking to someone who's like doesn't really understand what Zionism is, just say Moses was a Zionist, right? Like people don't actually like someone once recently was like, "Oh, Zionism, like that means you want to kill all of the Palestinians, right?" It's like, no, actually, it means that I don't think that anyone should kill Jews. I have a new motto for Zionism: no dead Jews. That's
Yeah.
it. 3 words. Keep it simple because I know that people don't know how to read anymore. And this dynamic that you're talking about with these kind of stereotypical characters, someone once told me that it's like every single Jewish marriage is like this. The Jewish mother is like, we're all gonna die. And the Jewish father is like, of fun? And I like this sort of the father figure here acknowledges like, yeah, they do want us dead, but like he's not like, and we're gonna now cancel the Seder. They don't cancel the Afikomen, and I'm I'm curious for you because so for me, my radicalization happened in 2021. That's when I became really woke to anti-Semitism. And that's when I saw things that people were posting in 2021. And I was like, there's no chance that Jews are going to be comfortable in the US by 2024. Not a chance. And people thought I was insane. And then after October 7th, people were like, oh, can you tell me why all of my friends hate me now? And I'm like, yeah, I would be happy to. Let me start a Substack for you. I'll call it the Zionist Voice. But it seems like your Jewish identity. Well, maybe I'll just leave it as an open-ended question. Can you tell me a little bit about your relationship with Jewish identity and how it's changed over time?
Yeah, so I was not my dad, I think, said this very well. He said, "I did not emphasize our Judaism when you and your brother were growing up." Um, he sent this was in a text message that he sent right after October 7th to our family group chat. And I think that's pretty accurate. I don't think it, my dad, I'll tell a story. So my dad went to prison because he was wrongly framed as a Jew, and that was very easy to do in
In
the
the
Soviet
Soviet
Union.
Union?
Yes, in the Soviet Union. Yeah. And so my parents came here on political asylum because my dad was basically wrongly imprisoned and
In
he
what
was
year?
1993, right? So he sat in prison. He was imprisoned right around the fall, and then he sat in prison for about a year, and then they came in 93 after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I recently found out actually that in 1993, that was kind of early Bill Clinton days, Clinton had actually really tightened Jewish immigration to the US because
The
in the very early
time-honored
90s,
tradition of American politics is to tighten Jewish immigration when no one's paying attention.
so there, I mean, I know I can name a million kind of Soviet Jews who I know personally, right? There are a lot of us, because there was a giant wave of immigration. There are basically no Jews left in Russia today. Like it's abysmally low. There's something like maybe like 10, 20,000 Jews left in Russia today, because they all left. Um, and
Or
the
unfortunately were killed
yeah,
in World War
or were
II or in the
yes,
Gulag or wherever.
right. But giant immigration wave in the 90s. And then my grandparents, actually, my grandpa remembers this. They had a chance to go to Israel, actually, and my grandpa was, for whatever reason, he was very against going to Israel. I think he said something like, "I don't want to raise my family um in a place where there's so much like political unrest." So they had a chance before my dad was in prison to actually go to Israel. I think that was in 89 or 90. And they didn't take it. And actually I have a friend who I know, her family was part of that wave of just the planes came in from Israel and they put everyone on the planes, and the end, all the Jews. My I think my grandparents were a little bit more optimistic. They had actually done very well in society. My grandpa was a colonel, and to be a Jewish colonel in the Soviet army is
Almost
basically
impossible.
unheard of. Like he either knew someone, or he got very lucky, or he was just such a so devoted to kind of the military cause that they had no choice and they had no excuse. But so he's a
And if
Jewish
he was a
colonel.
colonel, that probably also means he was qualified to be either a major or a general, realistically, if
That's
he
right.
was Jewish. Yeah.
Yeah. But he was up there. He was very well respected. So societally, because he had this, status of colonel, he he personally had never felt like, oh, this Jewish thing. So I think he was a little bit less paranoid, which is why he chose not to go to the plane in Israel. And then my grandmother was a chemistry professor, again, for a Jewish woman, and she was the head of her department, in the university she worked in. For a Jewish woman to be the head of the chemistry department is like virtually unheard of. And the way she got her professorship was, she had this, she ended up befriending someone who knew someone, and basically they granted her the professorship because otherwise there were, quotas on Jews in universities and all of that. So my dad, he also did very well university wise, and was an engineer. He joined this kind of top engineering firm, and so my parents grew up in Azerbaijan, which is one of the former Soviet republics.
Is that where your
And
family is ancestrally from, or were they
no,
relocated?
so they all just sort of ended up there. So Azerbaijan took in a lot of Jewish refugees during World War II. My grandfather was stationed there, and my grandmother, her mother, somehow ended up in Azerbaijan during World War II. And then my grandmother grew up there, and then my grandfather, is from Belarus, actually. So he was stationed in Azerbaijan, and they met while he was stationed there, um, during kind of.
And just for our listeners to know, Azerbaijan is a country that is just east of Armenia in the Caucasus region. I believe it borders Iran and Russia modern day, and it's very far away from where the majority of the fighting was in World War II, as opposed to Belarus, where there was a tremendous amount of fighting and unfortunately millions, thousands of
So
people died.
right. So my grandfather he was stationed there. My grandmother kind of grew up there. They ended up meeting, and then, obviously they ended up staying there, I think, because Azerbaijan back then had a very big Jewish population. It was like it's a Muslim country. It's a secular Muslim country, so it doesn't have any of the craziness of a typical Muslim country, going on. Basically, no one practices Islam. That's changing today. But back then in the Soviet Union, also you were barred from practicing Islam you were barred from practicing any religion in the Soviet Union. So there wasn't any of that. It was just a Soviet republic. But of course, historically, a lot of people there were of kind of Muslim background. So my dad grew up around a lot of Muslims. My mom's dad is actually Muslim as well. So my grandfather is actually Azeri. So that's, I guess, quarter like actually Azeri. So his roots are in Azerbaijan. And then yeah, so a lot of kind of Muslims, and they were very friendly. A lot of them were very friendly to the Jews. Um, and so a lot of kind of Jewish Muslim intermarriage even then, in Azerbaijan, because it wasn't. I don't think either religion was a big part of anyone's identity because
Right.
everyone was
You
just kind of
just simply
Soviet.
couldn't be, yeah, Soviet.
Yeah,
It's the only true religion is the Soviet Republic.
right. So there was that going on. I think because on both my parents' side, actually, they were, and my grandfather he was Muslim, and he worked for the oil business, for the government. So my parents both came from like very pretty respected backgrounds. Um, And what ended up happening was my dad joined a company, um, very quickly, just like rose very highly in the ranks because he was a good engineer. And people started to get suspicious of like, oh, why is this Jew getting all these promotions, whatnot? Because that's what happens when you're Jewish, especially in the Soviet Union. And so his Muslim coworkers decided to frame him for like fraud or theft or something like that. And right around that time, the Soviet Union fell apart. And what happened, a lot of people don't know this historically, was that you had a central governing system. Now there's no set legal precedents. Every country is now autonomous. They have no idea how to run themselves. Azerbaijan is a little bit of a weird country because it basically, was kind of a third world country until it got pulled into the Soviet Union. So Azerbaijan again had never had any sort of identity in that same way, and it had never had any sort of, like, set legal process as well. So, no one had any idea how to run anything. This was, like, literally this happened, like, a month or 2 after the Soviet Union fell apart. Um, no legal system, nothing. They decided we're just gonna put my dad in jail and, like, deal with it. So my dad was in prison for almost a year. He survived by basically gaining the respect of these, like, criminals and murderers. And they were just kind of nice to him, and my dad kind of learned how to navigate the universe, from that experience.
Was it technically a gulag or was it just a
It
regular
was not, it was just a kind of a Muslim, not Muslim, Azeri prison, just like a
Azeri
state
prison? Yeah.
prison. Yeah, so he was there. Meanwhile, obviously, my grandparents are panicking trying to figure out how to get him out.
They're still in Azerbaijan?
They're in Azerbaijan, so they ended up getting in touch with the US Embassy, and that was kind of right after the big wave of Soviet immigration to America. And Clinton had more or less closed Jewish immigration, but they, explained the situation. There were a lot of interviews. Um, they somehow they let my dad out for like a week or two, because I think they felt like there wasn't enough evidence. It was kind of like a parole situation. So in that week or two, my dad had one interview with U.S. government. They were like, "All right, great, come here." So my dad had 1 week to basically put together all of his stuff. Soviet authorities didn't let him bring, not Soviet, the Azeri authorities didn't let him bring more than one box. So each of my family members, my aunt came to, his sister, they had one box of belongings with them, and that was it. My grandmother still laments to this day that she left behind, she had this giant collection of Russian literature, which is, I think, where I get my love of literature from. She left all of it behind. The only 2 things that she brought over were her, um, collected Chekhov and collected Dostoevsky. Um, on my 21st birthday, she gifted me the Dostoevsky collection, so I have this kind of 13-volume collection of Dostoevsky in Russian, his complete works, which are on my bookshelf. And so, yeah, they brought everything with them that they could in those 1 boxes, and then they arrived in Chicago, and they kind of, were, living in the basement of a synagogue in, like, a Jewish kind of ghetto part of Chicago, for a while. And I did not know any of this until I turned 21. My family never talked about it, had no idea why we were here. Obviously, I knew that I was not
Did
my
you know
family was
you
not
were Jewish?
American. I knew obviously that they were from Russia. We did not speak Azeri, we spoke Russian at home. So there was that, like, Soviet identity. I didn't really know much, like, growing up about the whole, like, history of the Soviet Union.
Did you know
We
that
had
you
a
were Jewish?
That was, I knew I was Jewish. It was not brought up very often because I think there was just so much trauma around that topic. We did like we sometimes, like, lit the menorah. I went to Jewish daycare, so I had a little bit of I went to Jewish camp, had a little bit of exposure to that from that. Other than that, in my household, like, it was not talked about. We did, like, Hanukkah, we did Passover, we did, like, Purim. My grandmother baked, like, Hamantaschen, right? That was the extent of it. I did not have a bat mitzvah. It was not, again, not something that my parents, like, wanted to even touch. Um, and it wasn't until I got to college where I was conscious of the fact that I was Jewish, but it wasn't something I, like, thought about on a day-to-day basis. I got to college, and it was actually, um, I took this, like, Russian for heritage speakers class, and vast majority of Russian heritage speakers in my class were Jewish, of course, because, the Russians in America are gonna be Jewish. So this one guy was starting, this, like, Russian Jewish club at Columbia, and he invited me to come, and I felt I'd always felt like I'm a little bit socially awkward, as any writer is, I think. I'd always felt like I'd never had, like, a home, or, like, never really belonged anywhere, and I showed up to this club, and all of a sudden it was like I met, like, I've always had trouble making friends because 'cause I'm a little weird. I met 5 or 6 people I just clicked with immediately in that one pla and that had never happened to me in my life, and I realized, okay, there's something about this, like, Russian Jewish identity that is clearly central to who I am because I feel like these people understand me better than anyone, and my 2 best friends to this day, my co-maid of honors, as I've made them, I met in that club on that day. Um, so and I really I started to feel like, okay, there's something to Russian Jewish identity that connects us all and that kind of gives us a value system that's maybe a little bit different from your typical like American whatever. And that just got me really intrigued into Judaism. I started kind of learning more about it. And one of my friends, she was doing a minor in like Talmud studies. So she was like also Russian Jewish, like she was like really interested in learning the law, the history, all of this. And we just started talking. I started reading a lot more about it. And I think around like 2018, 2019, I started to learn about the history of Israel. I I have
Were
this
you at
essay.
Columbia at the time?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I
What year were
was.
you?
I must have been a junior. I think that was when I kind of got into it. Yeah, it was the beginning of my junior year. I showed up at that club. And
Got it.
then my second half of junior, I got really into it because I was like around all these people. Um, there was also this guy I liked in that club,
Of course,
who
right? How
ended up.
many clubs have we joined because we thought someone was cute in them and then
Yeah, well, we ended up dating. He is my ex. That ended up kind of working out for a little bit. This is my college ex. But, yeah, and part of it was probably I was just trying to impress him with, like, my knowledge of Judaism and whatnot, and he ended up knowing even less about me because he was also from a Soviet Jewish background, had no understanding of anything. Um, but I started to learn about Israel because I was showing up to, like, Hillel all of a sudden, and there were these conversations at Hillel that were like, "Are you a Zionist?" And I had no idea how to answer that question, because it seemed like people were, like, attacking me, and my, like, baseline understanding back then of Israel was, like, it was the Jewish country, and to be asked, like, "Do I support the Jewish country in a Jewish organization?" Hello, was just very strange to me, and so I started to feel like, "Okay, there's something going on here that I don't quite understand, let's figure out what that is." Um, and started just reading about it. I had read I had been forced to read the writings of Edward Said in my English
you didn't
class.
enjoy them?
Uh, I didn't really understand how central Edward Said was to the kind of Jews are colonizers narrative until I, like, really started looking into, like, the history of Israel. I read so many, like, history of Israel books.
Because my understanding is he's the guy. Like all modern anti-Zionism, all the combination of Marxism, Islamism, anti-Western ideology, all of that is it's from Edward Said, is my
Yes.
understanding. And the book he wrote is called Orientalism.
Yeah,
I think. Okay,
that's right. And we read it in my English class, which is, where my whole "Wait a minute, there's something wrong with English departments," thought process started from, was we were reading him for English class,
oh,
and all of a sudden.
I knew that I couldn't trust the English department because I was like, oh, maybe I'll take an English class, like Introduction to American Literature. Not a single novel, not a
Yeah.
single novel on
Yep,
the reading list. It was all secondary sources about
yep,
it. It's like,
yep,
uh, I want to read Moby Dick. I don't want to read someone's opinion about someone else's opinion about someone else's opinion about Moby Dick.
that's right. That's you have nailed English departments. I just, did an interview with the Republic of Letters, and
Another Substack, by the way.
another Substack. Um, I basically was saying that in my required there were 2 required courses that I took for English, one in my undergraduate, one in my master's. My required undergraduate course, we read basically every single theory possible, and then we read 2 books in that seminar, but everything else was theory. Master's, we had the same thing, it was the only required course you had to take as an English major. 0 books. 0. It was just the history of literary theory. And I this is my favorite story from my graduate school years. We read a commentary on Zora Neale Hurston. We
Zora
did
Neale
not read.
Hurston is, just for those of you who don't know, she was a great writer from the Harlem Renaissance era.
She is fantastic. I love her. We did not read her books. We read the commentary on her, and it, Zora Neale Hurston was a black woman. Okay, black plus woman to that cohort of humans called the English department means one thing and one thing only, that she's a radical liberal who's whatever. Um, and so none of my classmates knew that Zora Neale Hurston was actually a conservative. Like she was very against like everything liberal. Obviously, she was kind of like pro civil rights, but like economically, she was like very conservative. Um, she was very against like the FDR New Deal stuff.
And my
And that
understanding is there's also a big, literary debate that exists between her and Langston Hughes about how one should portray Black people in their
yes,
writing.
yes. So her, and the reason I love her as a watching God is it's obviously about blackness, but that's not the point in the way that blackness is the point of Toni Morrison's books. Let's say there's so much else going on that is just about fundamentally how human beings relate to each other. And there's kind of a redemption arc in Their Eyes Were Watching God. And to me, that is the mark of good literature, is it has to be universally relatable. It can explore obviously specific identities, but there has to be some sort of sense of universalism about it. And I think that's why I am not a fan of Toni Morrison, because if you remove the black identity component from her books, there's nothing in her books. If you remove the black identity component from Zora Neale Hurston, it loses a piece of it, of course, but there's still a fundamental kind of human narrative going on. And I think that's what really sets Zora Neale Hurston apart from any Black writer. She's my favorite Black author. I think that's what sets her apart, is she masterfully portrays human relationships beyond just the kind of I am Black narrative, right? So to go back to
Yeah,
the little
I sorry,
story here.
I just want
Yeah,
to push back just a little bit in defense of Toni Morrison, as I'm a huge Toni
sure.
Morrison fan, which is that I think that if you removed blackness from her books, you would still have wonderful literature and you'd have an incredible depiction of humanity. But I actually think one of the things that has been stolen from us is the ability to evaluate these writers like without considering race entire, like, right.
Yes.
And that's one of the things. It's like it gets so frustrating because, as you're saying, Zora Neale Hurston, there's a lot more going on than race, but everyone's going to say she's a black writer from the Harlem Renaissance. And the same thing is true for any writer, unless they're a hack, right? There are so many people who are now writing things that are it's just garbage. That's like, I think you actually posted something once that was like it was like the first page of a novel that was like, it was like the opening line was basically like, as a black woman in the
Yeah.
office place, this person made me feel X, which is like, that's just bad writing, and bad writing
Yes.
should be a criminal offense. Um, but
Yes. I know that is the opening to
we can move.
seven.
We'll focus on good writing. We're gonna focus
But
on
yes,
your work. Yeah,
I
I
know
just
exactly what you're
I'm not
talking about.
gonna I can't let if we're gonna talk about an author who I respect, I can't let that go. So we can have different opinions, but I'm gonna stand up for Toni Morrison here.
Sure.
But back to what we were talking about with the like the problem of the English department.
Right. So, just to kind of finish up that story, so many people obviously had never read Toni Morrison, because not Toni, sorry, Zora Neale Hurston in that class, because they hadn't been asked to read her, because they'd just been asked to read the criticism of her, and the criticism of her was just so focused on like, this is a black woman, right? And there were so many other themes. I started to bring up actual themes in Their Eyes Were Watching God, because I think I was probably the only person in that seminar who had actually read the book. Um, and this in the criticism that we were reading was of Their Eyes Were Watching God. So it was very relevant. And this one girl,
Wait, I'm sorry.
I
They had you read a criticism of a book they didn't expect you to read?
that's right. That's right.
All right. If anyone who's listening to this is a teacher or works with anyone in any capacity, you don't do that. Okay? You read the book. You read the book and you develop your own opinion, and then you read someone else's criticism of it. I'm sorry that Columbia is a real second-rate university. You shouldn't send any kids there, but like, that's absurd.
Yeah. I I had a pretty good analogy for this. It's like, imagine you read a book about the music of Beethoven, and you had never heard the music of Beethoven. That book would mean nothing to you. There's nothing to gain from a criticism of Beethoven without actually sitting and listening to Beethoven. I think it's more apparent for music because I think, you can the medium is different.
I actually think it's pretty apparent for books too. We've just been conditioned to think that people who are academics might know something, but like, no, this is dumb. And I feel very
Yeah.
confident saying this is a terrible system.
Yeah, and, I think, unfortunately, that's what's going on, and in my seminar, I brought up a point from Their Eyes Are Watching God that was not in the, like, criticism of Their Eyes Are Watching God, because I wanted to talk about the actual book, not
How
the
dare you?
criticism
How dare you?
of it, and this one girl in my seminar, she goes, "There is no way that actually happened in the book. That like you're making that up." Like, and she was so conditioned to like think about it in terms of and I think I think what I had brought up was that there's this moment where the protagonist in Their Eyes Are Watching God, Janie, she's a little bit of like, I don't want to call it sadomasochistic because I don't like that word because it's just overused today in the literary world. She has a little bit of that sort of relationship with um this other man in the book, and I had basically brought up the point of kind of there's more to the love that they have than just violence. And I think that's kind of what's going on in Their Eyes Are Watching God, and that this girl was just very, very offended that I would dare like defend, in her words, this like kind of like abusive relationship or whatnot, and she was like, Zorn your Horson would like never write that. I was like, read the book, honey.
Right, right. It's yeah, thinking about I went to the Frida Kahlo Museum in Mexico City, which is an amazing museum if you're ever in Mexico City, an amazing city to travel to. And there's stuff there about her relationship with Diego Rivera. And someone once said, when I read this quote, it completely changed my entire understanding of abuse. Someone said, Frida, do you resent Diego for beating you? And she said I'm botching the quote, but she said something along the lines of, does the river bank resent the river for rushing over it? And there's a we we are we are conditioned, as we should be, to hate abuse, to hate all forms of abuse and of violence committed against one another. But if we completely block out our eyes to what happens in an abusive relationship, we'll never understand why people stay in them. Right? That the reality is that most people who are in abusive relationships are in some capacity choosing to be in them. And I haven't read Their Eyes Were Watching God, but it sounds basically like there's this love element to it as well. And I think with theory we end up just brushing over so much nuance in the world such that it actually no longer exists, and we turn everything into basically like flat facades of things.
Yeah, I think you know there's so much that happens in Their Eyes Are Watching God. I read it in high school for the first time, and then I reread it again recently, and I think there's so much of kind of abuse that for this main character Janie is intertwined with love, and I think it's a touchy subject, of course. But I think part of it is, commenting on kind of the difficulty of having this, domestic relationship and figuring out, why am I staying, or why do I, have these sorts of maybe like trauma responses. So I think I think it's something that Hurston explores, and I think it's not, like a black and white answer. And I think also, especially with like male female relationships, they're going to go full circle to where we started today. There's this, expectation that male female relationships are going to end in one way, especially today, which is, the man is abusive to the woman and then the woman gets liberated, right? And that's how it always goes. I had this one literary agent. This is my favorite story from my careering process. Um, he wrote to me that he didn't think my book would resonate with contemporary audiences because the female protagonist was surrounded by supportive men. And so
And well, more broadly, perhaps the female protagonist would be hated for having a relationship. And so, like there was a piece that came out recently that was like having a boyfriend
yeah,
is
it's like not cool anymore.
right, exactly. It's like not cool. And it's like, oh, that's crazy because literally every single woman I know has always wanted to be in a relationship of some kind. Whether or not she admits it, right? There's, oh, and it's like, oh, eh, I think I appreciate you bringing it full circle because I was also about to bring it back to Zionism because I think what we're really seeing, and I'm feeling this image very powerfully right now, is a power washing of the mountain. And what I mean by that is there's a mountain of meaning in the human experience that we've got love, you've got race, you've got work, you've got, I don't know, insecurity, you've got children, you've got the whole gamut of experiences, and they're nuanced, right? There's crags and there's trees and there's, if you were going to paint a beautiful painting of a mountain, you would need to look at the mountain very closely and acknowledge where all of the different, where are the crevasses, where are the jutting points, etc. And I think that the reality is for 5,000 years, we're like, hey, that's a pretty big mountain. And it's like actually kind of scary to think about all of those different things. And for some reason, recently, people have been like, it is kind of a scary mountain, but if we power wash it and we just hit it with as much acid as possible, we can actually smooth out all of those nasty little complications, right? We
Yeah.
can, it will say that, well, men are fundamentally only interested in one thing and it's disgusting. And so every time a man talks to you, he's trying to, take advantage of you. And it's like, yeah, or maybe like he's like having a bad day and he's hoping that someone will smile at him or something. Or maybe he actually just like needs to know if maybe he's just interested in what you're reading, actually. Like I never ask women what they're reading when I see them at coffee shops, even though I'm always curious because I'm like, oh my God, you're reading a book. I want to like thank them. Like like thank you for doing this thing, right?
Yeah.
Preserving this tradition of reading. And I think it's really interesting with this Israel and Zionism, right? Because before the Students for Justice in Palestine as an organization was created in 2001. Before that, I would say basically it seems like when you read most people who were not Jewish or Palestinian were like, "Ooh, this is a real complicated conflict you got over there." Right? And then recently dumbest people I know have been telling me it's like, no, actually, Ted, it's not that complicated. It's extremely simple. You're wrong and I'm right. And I'm like, really? What are we talking about here? Who's the first king of Palestine? And they were like, oh, well, Jesus Christ. And I'm like, really? And like, what kind of government system do they have? It's like, oh, it's a perfect socialist utopia. And I was like, really? Like, and how come Palestinians? How come the language they speak how come the word for their country that they're allegedly indigenous to is not possible to be spoken in their native tongue, right? There's no P sound in Arabic. So there's no way that an Arabic speaking people would name their own country something they can't pronounce. And these things, I mean, these are just like, this is the tip of the iceberg. How do you had this sort of experience basically? You're entering Jewish consciousness with this Russian Jewish group, basically in 2018, 2019. You start participating more in Hillel, and you start kind of now you're kind of facing these questions of Zionism. So that's when you first start learning about Israel. I'm always curious for people like in this process. I imagine there would have been a lot of pressure for you to just sort of immediately adopt an anti-Israel stance.
So I have an essay called My Best Friend Was Palestinian, which is true. Um my best friend from high school was Palestinian. And the essay kind of traces the gradual erosion of our relationship that was basically sparked by just my interest in learning more about Israel. So I actually had a very tangible, um, counter argument. I would always attempt to have just these like civil discussions with her about Israel and Palestine. It's I'm very proud of this essay that I wrote because I think it just very accurately like traces my gradual like, disillusionment with the people around me in this whole topic. Kind of the more I learned, the more I realized that there was just something wrong about the way that Israel was being portrayed. Um, and the kind of final straw in our friendship was October 7th, um, where I had basically, like, every single Jewish person I know basically had, like, posted something to social media about, like, you know, my heart goes out to Israel right now, like, pray for the terrorist, attack victims. And she responded to that, and she got so angry that I was defending Israel, and we got into this, like, blow up fight over it. And she basically said, like, "Well, Israel is committing genocide," and this was, like, October 8th. This was before anyone had even, like, used the word genocide in the media, that sort of thing. So that to me, in retrospect, I realized that word, the Palestinians had been basically subverting it before, anyone in the New York Times decided to, present it that way. And I basically wrote back to her. I'll read you exactly what I wrote back to her because I think I'm very proud of this message. I said, we may never see eye to eye on this issue, given our respective backgrounds, and that's neither your choice nor mine. I think we believe in the same fundamental principles, and it's unfortunate that this conflict unfolded the way it did. I'm never opposed to having a civil discussion about this and trying to understand one another. I'd be more than happy to rebuild our friendship over coffee. We are both fundamentally human and we both want to protect our loved ones. Let me know if you'd like to give this a try. I felt like that was a very mature message, especially because both of us, I think, were running on emotions like right after October 7th. She left me on red. Never responded to that. And I haven't talked to her since that day. And it breaks my heart because she was my best friend for 10 years. In kind of since from high school up until October 7th. Um, and, I think that's just kind of a testament to how fraught this issue is and my very obvious example of I think there's something about that the other side doesn't want to have a discussion about it. They're not open to hearing the Jewish perspective. They're just not. And the fact that I sent that message to my friend of like, hey, let's figure out where there's maybe overlap here, and she decided not to do that. I think just speaks volumes to how narrow-minded a lot of people who like believe in the Palestinian cause are. They don't want to have a discussion. They just want to parrot their ideology and destroy Israel, and that's kind of the objective there.
Right. And first of all, let me say I'm so sorry. I mean, that's a very painful experience. I mean, which is more painful, having a friend who turns on you or having a friend who's not even willing to talk to you after the fact? And unfortunately, you're not alone, right? That's happened to basically every single Jew in America. I I've written a piece about the the friends I can't talk to. I've probably written it 10 different times since October
Yeah.
7th. Just like I haven't had the heart to publish it because I keep living in this fantasy basically that I'll get a call from them one day and they'll be like, I was wrong.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I abandoned you when you needed me most because I was afraid of the social repercussions. And
Yeah.
I try to have some empathy and understanding because the reality is that I went to high school with so many people who were not anti-Semitic. And then when they graduated from college, they were crazy anti-Semitic without even realizing it. And you have this situation, which is like, it's again, you have to give credit where credit is due. So anti-Zionism is a movement. It's the most philosophically absurd proposition in the world, right? I, as a person living in a not in a country that I living in country X believe that country Y should cease to exist. period.
Yes.
It's and it's you could only get something like that ideology from the Soviet Union, which has the ability to basically pervert all types of logic. And I give them a lot of credit. I mean, it's the most impressive propaganda campaign of all time. Like since 1968, the anti-Zionist cause has done more to change the way that people think about the world than any other intellectual
Yeah,
movement,
yeah.
I think. And so firstly, I got to say, like, I am sorry because that is a very painful experience. Uh,
It's I've had kind of 2 years to mull it over at this point, and I sometimes I recently got engaged. It kind of sucks that, my kind of best friend for 10 years isn't gonna be at my wedding, and that's something that I had to kinda come to terms with. Um, and, I as you do, I've fantasized about kind of, reaching out to her or maybe getting a message from her saying, "I'm so sorry, like, let's figure this thing out." And I think the ironic part is that I think we became friends in high school because we both had the experience of being kind of like outsiders of, we went to this like very like white waspy type school, and I was like the weird Jewish kid and she was the weird Arab kid, and I think that kind of brought us together. And so it's really ironic that it seems to me like the very thing that brought us together, and we both, I see actually a lot of overlap, with kind of Muslim values and Jewish values, and I think that's something that we had discussed, very often in high school, was there was both this kind of emphasis on, like, family, and it was family first, right, in both cultures, and I think that's something that, um, also brought, my grandparents on my mom's side together because, again, my grandfather was Muslim, and I think that kind of overlap was the reason that we became friends, and we had so much in common from that, and we both valued tradition in many ways. And, I think at the end of the day, our objectives were just to make sure our family had a safe home, and I think we both cared about the same thing. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of propaganda going on in the, I mean, if you go to kind of a Palestinian school, they're literally taught that, murdering Jews is virtuous, like, unironically. And I think that kind of big propaganda push from the kind of, Hamas or the Palestinian Authority is unfortunately responsible to a lot of this, like, general Jew hatred. And, our my friendship with that friend had been it had been eroding. It's not like October 7th happened and then it just exploded. It had been gradually
right.
unraveling, I think, for many years. It was just that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So, it is what it is, and I am also, sorry to hear about your friends. I've certainly lost several friends since October 7th, and that's something I've just kind of come to terms with. And I also have friends who I'm still friends with who are maybe it's just not something that we talk about. Maybe they're a little bit like more pro Palestine. I don't think I have any friends now who are like fully like death to Israel. But I have friends who are kind of, who like think Benjamin Netanyahu is like Satan or whatnot, or that Israel is kind of an evil country, and the socialists like Ben Gurion days were like the way to go, and now everything is bad. So again, it's not a topic that I touch on with some friends. And then I have other friends who are pro Israel, but don't understand it at the same level as, you could understand as a Jewish person. I think it hits us in a different way, and I'm, obviously very grateful to, like, my Christian friends or just, my general, maybe, like, center right leaning friends who are just, like, pro-Israel just for the sake of it, because they see that that's kind of the morally good, stance to have. But it's still difficult because I think my other Jewish friends are the only friends who, like, really get why this is so important.
Right. Sorry, I had to plug my computer in again, but
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, it's we really the whole Jewish world changed post October 7th, and I think that I was taking notes while you were talking, and I was thinking about this, that in this scene that you give us in is it called The Yellow Star? Or no, it's just called Yellow.
Yeah, yeah.
This scene that you give us in Yellow, it kind of is this watershed. We've all had this moment, right? The moment where basically you realize that we are returning to our grandparents' world, and the myth is no longer here. And I think, well, the way I would basically say it is the anti-Zionist Jews who I know, and this is very painful, but I basically see them as kind of the Bundist of the past. And for the Bund was this organization, it was opposed to Zionism and basically said, we can join our socialist brothers in Poland and Russia and Ukraine and create a beautiful socialist republic. And every member of the Bund was killed in the Holocaust or the Gulag, right? And there's I have this constant fear that basically like all of the anti-Zionist Jewish friends I had who are now like throwing me under the bus, like they're doing it because they know what time it is. They know how unpopular Judaism is in
Oh,
the
yeah.
progressive movement. And so they're demonstrating like, I'm the right Jew. I'm your Jew. I'm the good Jew. And, those were the first people who were killed in the Holocaust. And I think um, it's a weird thing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with that. There was, I can't remember where I read this. I recently read somewhere, it was a book about kind of, again, like Soviet Jewry, where, the author was discussing, oh, you know what it was? It was The Captive Mind by Czeslaw Milosz. Not about Soviet Jewry, just about the Soviet Union in general. And he was talking about basically the Jews who were the most neurotic were the Jews who left Germany or Europe. And the Jews who were more optimistic were the ones who stayed, and then they got screwed over. The Jews who kind of, said that, everything's fine and great, and then they obviously were killed in
Only
the
the anxious
Holocaust.
survive.
Yeah, and and so he basically said that's why, a lot of Jews are so neurotic because we've now only the ones who survived reproduced, the anxious ones reproduced, and the optimistic ones were killed, and that is why Jews have this like sixth sense of danger, because the optimistic ones are unfortunately no longer with us.
Right, and our grandparents were all friends with those optimistic people, and my novel is actually about it's about this exactly. It's an intergenerational story, and it kind of takes place trying to understand. It's called Wresting Beauty from the Darkness, also about trying to find meaning and beauty in the modern world. Um, and it's about these two characters, one who is essentially like my age, who's in Europe, and one who is like our grandparents' age, who's a Holocaust survivor. And we come to find out basically that the two of them had their families are from the same town in, Poland, basically, or in the Pale of Settlement. And when the Zionists came to their town in the 1920s and said, hey, anti-Semitism in Europe is out of control. We need to go and live, start Israel, basically. The anxious friend, whose name is Avraham, he freaks out. He gets so neurotic and anxious. He can't stop thinking about it. And he's like, I have to go. But his friend, who's a very well-to-do and successful Polish man, he's like, I have a business. This is the first time Jews have ever had a business. Why would I leave now? Et cetera, et cetera. So he decides to stay. So one family goes first to Argentina and then to the US and all of these things. One family stays in Europe. And basically the scene that begins that family's life is right before the Nazis come to town. Basically, all of their Polish neighbors, collect all of them, basically put them in. They have them dig their own grave, this mass grave in a trench. And the father is standing with his son. And the last words he says to his son, basically before the machine guns open fire, is, "The Zionists were right. Am Yisrael Chai."
Mhm.
Machine guns open
Wow.
and they kill everybody in the line, and basically this young boy wakes up in the pile of bodies, and he's 8 years old. So anyways,
Wow,
I
very
think
powerful.
we have this consciousness of like it's not that far away, right? It's not that like something I still I still think about is that there were Holocaust survivors who were killed on October 7th. There were Holocaust survivors who were held captive in Gaza, and not one, not one American intellectual pointed out the depravity of this fact, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it's the silence for me is what hurts the most. I don't know how you feel about it, but the silence and the callousness.
Yeah, I think it's there's basically no one on our side except sane Jews. And I think that that's been very hard for me to kind of wrap my head around because I think even sane people, and I say sane in contrast to, like, let's say the sort of person I encountered at Columbia in the English department. Even some of the saner people I know are reluctant to speak out about this because, um, I mean, the other unfortunate thing that's happening is that on the right, there's also a new kind of renewed wave of anti-Semitism from like the Nick Fuentes world, right? So I
Anyone who's
think,
interested in learning about it, we have a publication out called I forget what it's called, but I think it's called Down the Right Wing Rabbit Hole. It's about all of the things you want to know about the right wing anti-Semitic loop if you haven't read it.
yeah, so there's that I think is it's not new, but I think we haven't really heard about that since like Charlottesville, let's say, which was 2014, right? So I think
I think
that
we
that's
also
been
heard about it in 2017 with the Unite the Right rally.
that's right. That's right. Um so I think it's been a little bit dormant. And I think back then it was really more those two events were really more kind of fringe movements. I don't think anyone was really taking them seriously. It was just like a very small group of people, and then basically everyone condemned them, right? Now there's this kind of renewed wave of anti-Semitism from the right, that I think was sparked by October 7th, because from the right, the kind of America First crowd is seeing that there are basically people who care about Israel, and then they see that as a threat to, whatever ideology that they have. And so I think the murder of Charlie Kirk, I think, really catalyzed all of this, where, Charlie Kirk was kind of this more moderate, let's say, right-wing figure, uniting the kind of Republican Party, and then, he's gone. Now Nick Fuentes is starting to kind of alarmingly take his place. And so you have this weird renewed spirit of anti-Semitism in various degrees from the right, which I think also is a little bit chilling because I I think before this year, I was more used to at least the anti-Semitism coming from the left, which was it's just kind of the like anti-Zionist, like socialists and whatnot. Now you're starting to see it also crop up from the right. So now it's kind of an extra kind of facet for us Jews to handle. And a lot of kind of more right-leaning folks that I would have expected, not anyone I know personally, but maybe like people from Substack or generally on the internet, that sort of thing. A lot of those people have, I think, taken more of an ambiguous stance on Israel, or are maybe supporting more of this kind of, Nick Fuentes group. And I think that that's really alarming. And you're seeing it from kind of right wing commentators as well. I think more are going towards, this Nick Fuentes world, or at least are entertaining that idea. Like Megyn Kelly, I think,
Right,
kind of
right, right.
refused to. I my
The Heritage Foundation refused to
Yes, the
criticize.
Heritage
Yeah.
Foundation. I so much respect for Ben Shapiro. I have gained over the past couple weeks just this incredible respect for Ben Shapiro for being like, "No, this is wrong. Like, you guys are all wrong. Like, what is happening to the Republican Party right now?" And so I think he's probably like the only kind of mainstream right-wing voice who's really speaking up about this.
Right.
So
And
kudos
and
to him.
he is also looked at basically as the enemy by these people, right? Nick Fuentes would basically say, "Oh, of course Ben Shapiro, because he's the Zionist who's trying to convert all of the he's Ben Shapiro." So after Charlie Kirk's assassination, I went on a deep dive into right-wing anti-Semitism on Facebook, because you get your reels algorithmically sent to you. So if you are curious about these things, they will continue to send you more. So basically, I was able to convince Facebook that I was a right-wing Christian nationalist, um, and but what I learned basically, it's really fascinating, and I think my background is in history. Once I learned that the English department was all theory, I said, okay, I'll stay in the history department because they actually read these books. Um, and Princeton, luckily, actually, the history department was still basically preserved in the kind of old European academic tradition, which was like, hey, you don't smell like old paper. I can't possibly respect what you're saying.
Sure.
Um, and so my background is in history, and specifically within how revolutionary movements are built through rhetoric.
Yeah.
And something I've always talked about is that Nazism is a progressive philosophy. People miss this all the time because we contrast it with communism. So we're like, oh, fascism is right wing, but it's not really right wing. There's no free market in a fascist state, right? The fundamental principle of Nazism is we can build a better world by getting rid of all of the problems vis-a-vis Jews, right? And communism is the same thing. We can get rid of all of the problems by getting rid of the capitalists vis-a-vis Jews. Um, and one of my biggest concern, because I grew up on the left. I'm from LA. You can't be a Republican in LA as a young. It's just like actually not possible, basically. Um, and so
Yeah.
I didn't, but I knew enough to know basically that liberals don't have what it takes to actually win. That there's this deep aversion to playing the game to win. With like classically, like every time the Democrats lose a presidential election, like it's someone else's fault. Like, no, like don't blame the Electoral College. Those have been the rules for 250 years. Like if you can't figure out how to play, you need to change your system. But so basically, my concern was always that liberal anti-Zionists would make anti-Semitism, would normalize it again, right? And they would bring it back into public discourse. And then the right-wing Nazis, they've been laying in wait for, 50, 100 years because they never, like, it's not like after World War II, we went through the ranks of American intellectual life and said, okay, Henry Ford, you were a Nazi, we're removing you. No, right? Ford is still the biggest car manufacturer in the US. Um, and I think what we've really seen is basically that it's ironic, and people wouldn't really recognize this, but Nardine Kiswani, Zoran Mamdani, all of the progressive people who have normalized anti-Zionism made it possible for Nick Fuentes to become popular. And I've been following Nick Fuentes' work since 2018 because I'm sort of a masochist and I love studying I'm fascinated by anti-Semitism because there's actually only two eternal things in human history, and it's the Jewish people and the people who hate us. And like also in 20 just for context, in 2018, Nick Fuentes went on this whole thing about how basically black men could be converted to the conservative right-wing Nazi movement because of all of the things that they agree on. It was in 2018, and in
Interesting.
2024, Donald Trump got the highest percentage of black male votes in the Republican Party's recent history.
Yeah. It's interesting.
And it
Oh, no, I I I think the Nick Fuentes my fiancé does the same thing, actually, he, like, watches Nick Fuentes to just kinda see what what Nick Fuentes is saying, um, and, some of the things that he's told me Nick Fuentes has said, I don't like to watch him, the only time I've really heard him talk is when, Ben Shapiro did a segment on, kind of his thing with Tucker Carlson. I saw
yeah.
some excerpts from that, but, I mean, some of the shit he says is just absolutely crazy, and it's insane to me that that would resonate with any sane person, but it seems to just have gotten a bigger following. You're right, because I think the left has allowed it to happen and they've just kind of fully normalized it. So the right has kind of used that as an excuse to come in and say, well, you know, now it's our turn. So right, I mean, I think there's an attack on from both sides.
I
I
sorry, I just
yeah,
forgot to mention this. It's also from a political science perspective, anti-Semitism is brilliant. If you can blame everything in the world on 2% of the population, you have 98% of the like, so actually from a
That's
political
right.
stance, you should always want to tend towards anti-Semitism. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the whole the whole thing is just really alarming right now, and it's scary to think that we are so alone, and I have just felt so comfortable kind of meeting other Jewish people lately and just a little bit of anxiety even with, talking to other folks, because it's, not something that I like to bring up. I don't even like really bring up Judaism in any sense because I think it has started to put people off. And I think that's really unfortunate. But it is what it is. And I think the best thing right now that we can do is just stick together as a Jewish people and hope that we get through it as we have been getting through things for thousands of years.
Right. And I think, yes, it does put people off to talk about Judaism. I mean, and I remember when I was in college and I would talk to people about like my Jewish faith and Jewish God and Jewish ideas and be like, wow, that's fascinating. That's incredible, right? And now it's like, but I
The response
think
is different.
right. And the I sort of had in working on my novel and kind of thinking about this older character, right, who survived the Holocaust. His name is Yaakov. I think about Yaakov a lot. And when Yaakov meets the protagonist, Javier Levine, there are these conversations they have. And I had this image once where I was like, what would Yaakov say to me if I was telling him about how alone I felt? It'd be like, "You fool. What world were you living in before that you thought we had friends?" Right? Like, it's called the
Yeah.
United Nations, which if you translate that roughly to Yiddish would be Goyim United. We should have known. Like, we should have known that and at the end of the day, and this is a large part of also why I became more religious, and I saw this from my students, which is that the Jewish people are not alone, right? The Jewish people have God on our side. I know it's not very popular to talk about religion most of the time, but you can define God however you want. But if you look at the Jewish people, you have to ask the real reason I became religious. It happened in a unseasonably warm day, February of 2020, right before I was kicked out of college, where basically I was in my English constitutional history class, and we learned something basically about how powerful Henry VIII was. And I won't get into it, but it's clear that if Henry VIII had had a male son, there would have been no political crisis in England that would have led to Parliament and the Civil War and all of that stuff. And I just had this thought, which was like, wow, the distribution of Y chromosomes in Henry VIII's testicles is the thing that determines all of modern history. It's like, and that's when I was like, oh, maybe there's someone maybe someone is watching how things develop and is kind of controlling these things. And, you look at it's actually really when you see anti-Semites, right? They're constantly trying to explain how can the Jewish people be so successful, right? And what I've concluded is that there's really only three perspectives that exist in the world about this. There's the traditional secular approach to it, which is like the Jews are successful because of a literary tradition, right? Every Jewish child learns how to read. We have books in our houses. Those are the kinds of things that make you successful. I think most people find that argument to be accurate, but unsatisfying because basically what it means is if you want to be successful, you have to work harder, and no one wants to work harder. The anti-Semitic response, which is no, 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 the Jews are cheating, right? The Jews have this secret conspiracy where they pass out money, and look, there are two poets who are talking to each other, and both of them have eaten food. And for that to be the case, someone must have done something wrong because poets don't eat, right?
Yeah.
So that's the anti-Semitic answer. Or there's the Jewish religious answer, which is no, God said, I'm choosing these people and they're going to be blessed. And that's been how it is for 3,000 years. Um, and it's like, none of those answers is really compel. Like, I think most people either they believe one of those answers in its entirety, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
eh, sorry, I
I
sort of
mean,
lost my own train of thought there.
oh no, you're good. I mean, I think a good good kind of ending point for that thought is I think, there's a lot in our value systems that, that I tend to be of the first camp of the Jewish people are successful because they work very hard. I think there's so much in our value system if you just, kind of read the Torah, that teaches us the same values that have been passed down. And again, as I said, I didn't grow up like so consciously Jewish, but who I am is very fundamentally embedded with Judaism, and I think that's just a testament to how strong that kind of value system is. That consciously or not, that's what my parents instilled in me as a kid was kind of you have to persevere. I was talking to another Russian Jew, a couple days ago, and he said that, his dad instilled in him that you are Jewish, so you will need to work twice as hard for everything in life, and that kind of instilled the value of hard work in him. And I think that's true in one way or another for basically all Jewish families or all Jewish kids, is that there's something in our value system that just, like it or not, makes us successful. And I think if more people learned from us, then there would be kind of a more overall success. But it's easier to just blame society and say, everything is unfair than to, suck it up and do the work.
Right. And I think people are in some ways are also afraid of success is the wrong word, but like I think there are a lot of people would prefer to be unsuccessful than to do the work that is
Yeah.
required for success. And
Yeah.
that's what we're
Yeah.
trying to get people to do here, which is to realize that if you want a better life, make your life better. You have to work for it, right? There's no
Right.
other
And
way
I
around it.
think part of Judaism, at least for me, is kind of your fate is in your own hands, right? And I think I've very much been led by that, and I think that's why I hate the kind of woke mindset so much, is because the woke mentality says basically, the reason you're unsuccessful is because of external societal forces, and you're oppressed and whatnot. And I think that's fundamentally
Right.
false. I mean, my family has been oppressed more than anyone, really. So, and I've still kind of emerged with a fairly good life, I should like to think. And I think that's because my kind of philosophy on everything has been like, even if the world is against you, you gotta keep going. And I think that's the reason that the Jewish people overwhelmingly have seen so much success in the world.
Right. Right. And I think this will be a really nice way for us to kind of wrap up because that image that you're talking about, right? The Jew against the world, that is
Yeah,
the Jewish people. It begins with Abraham, right? It's one man against everybody else. And the idea that
absolutely.
you're a victim of your circumstances, that is the pagan world. That's the world that Abraham is born into. That's the world of everybody else. What Judaism introduces is this idea of a covenantal relationship where between you and God. And the religious experience as a Jewish person is not discovering that you believe in God. It's about discovering that God believes in you and that God made you to be the vehicle of his miracles or of his creation, and you are the one who can transform the situation and the circumstances around you. And so I've been thinking about this a lot because the insignia for the Zionist voice, I don't know if I'll be able to show it well, but
Ah,
yeah, it's a yellow
yeah.
star on a field of blue. It says the Zionist voice. If you will it, it is no dream. Im tirzu enzo agada, the famous Herzl quote. And
I
so
love that.
now, like the the vision for me is to turn the yellow star into a golden star and to change our identity from being Jews who must bear this burden to Jews who shine our light into the world. And so
That's
taking
beautiful.
one more piece from your brilliant seventh grade teacher. Now that we've had this discussion, I would like you to once again read Yellow for us, and we can think about this as we
Yes,
move
I
out.
will. Oh, all right. Yellow. On the evening of the Pesach, we were piled into Uncle Asher's scarlet Lexus, breathing through the grape juice scented whiff of that old pipe I never liked much as a kid, but which reminded me of Seder celebrations and the matzahs that my father always hid in our apartment when the Seder meant you couldn't eat the challah. My cousins had a group of kids, the darling boys, a year apart, girls dressed in tutu skirts, and the oldest on the eve of his bar mitzvah, Max. The evening on their doorstep, we had gathered wishes on the blue mezuzahs, and my father donned his kippah. Max was in Cologne to woo the girls at school, and Uncle Asher drank the wine alone, the preferred beverage of the evening, grape juice. We arranged the Seder plate and lost the bone, but to the dog, and Aunt Adina hid the matzahs in the yard for all the kids to find. Someone complained that Max was in the game, but he was not yet a bar mitzvah, so it was conceded. And anyway, he lost, likely by his own design. Max was in a Star of David and a yellow kippah, which had fallen somewhere in the yard while he was running. Nevertheless, the evening carried on, and Uncle Asher gave him a replacement, reading, in blue letters like the blue mezuzah, never again. And I am sure he knew the implications. We heard the newscast ringing from the TV. Today, they were not letting Jews on campus. I thought it was a joke the news had played. And we were not yet through the prayers when Max exclaimed, "They want us dead?" And Uncle Asher said, "Who needs these clowns?" And Aunt Adina said, "They'll be arrested." And my dad said, "Yes." But we are just celebrating, eating matzah, sitting as a family, together, just like other families. What have we done wrong? In the yard, I found the yellow kippah, and it reminded me of yellow stars.
In the yard, I found the yellow kippah, and it reminded me of yellow stars. Liza, thank you so much for coming in. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Liza Libes with her new collection, Girl Soldier. You can find it on Amazon, and you can find her work at Pens and Poison on Substack and Instagram. And are you also on Twitter?
Uh, yes, but I don't use it. But you can still find me on Twitter
Find
under
her
Pen
on
Poison.
Twitter, but that's not the best place to find her. Thank you all so much for joining us on This Way Up, brought to you by the Zionist Voice. I'm your host, Ted Goldstein, and as always, spread love, spread light. I'm Yisrael Chai. Thank you all.
Thank you.